Catherine's watching. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the council meeting of the 21st of February 2019. I'm being specific because this meeting is being live streamed. The video will be available on YouTube. And can I just remind everybody to speak clearly into our microphones, and of course, as is normal practice anyway, only one speaker at a time, so that that's clear. So getting on to the meeting itself, any apologies, we do have one from Councillor Catherine Stewart, and I've also been notified that Councillor Brown and Councillor Morris will be here shortly. So just someone to move Councillor Mason and Councillor Clout. All in favour say aye. Against, carried. There's been no request to speak in the public forum today, and there are no late items as far as I know. Anybody got a late item? Any change to the order of business? I'm probably going to suggest that we discuss the major item first, and then let it lie on the table and deal with the other agenda items, and then come back to that, because that might inform that first item anyway. Any declarations of conflicts of interest? Yep.
Yes, Your Worship. So in DC8, the Community Wellbeing Fund, I'll step out of any discussion relating to the People's Project.
Okay, so that's noted. Thank you. And now on to the business proper, and the first item, DC17. And Paul, are you going to speak to that?
Good morning, Mayor and elected members. I'll give an introduction to this paper, go over some of the final implications, and then Christine will just give a brief overview of some of the implications, particularly around the capital program, which is impacting heavily on this report. So three fundamental components to this report. The first is confirmation, similar to the situation in December in terms of the annual plan, looking at an average residential rate increase of CPI plus 2%. The second is to do with a proposal to look at an introduction of a debt retirement levy. I'll talk more about that, and Christine will talk more about that as well in a moment. And the third is just around the user fees and charges proposed for the annual plan. The key points to note on this is, since the decision was made on the 3.7 or the 2% plus CPI in December, a number of things happened particularly around growth-related projects, particularly in recent weeks, largely to do with the costings associated with that project. Christine will go into a little bit more detail, but in short, it's looking at adding around $128 million of additional capital expenditure over the 10 years. We thought it was prudent to bring back to you a confirmation around the decision of the rating level, and look to discuss the introduction or the reintroduction of a debt retirement levy, given the latter years of that 10-year plan now are outside of our financial prudence limits, particularly the 250% ratio that when we brought this to you in December, it was actually sitting within those limits, albeit fairly close to those limits. So point out that we can't resolve the long-term issues in the annual plan here. However, what we're bringing to you is an option to look at a financially prudent approach to introduce and recognise the fact that there is significant pressure on those outer years, and to note that there's a number of pieces of work that are actually going to occur over the next 1 to 2 years, which will also impact on that. You heard the other day around the different funding and financing options. That's an element of it. A review of the balance of the 10-year plan, which will occur, and looking at different rating options and so forth. But so what this paper here refers to as an option of actually starting that journey in terms of actually recognising that there is some significant financial risk happening in the latter years. We've got on your tables, there's an attachment handed out in terms of what those levies would look like. The suggestion would be, as the Mayor has said, to leave that on the table until we actually go through the other papers and then discuss in more detail what the implications of those options are on our numbers, both for the annual plan year and the impacts in terms of those prudential borrowing limits in future years. So I'll hand over to Christine just in terms of probably a bit more detailed explanation in terms of that $128 million movement.
So it's to start off with the period of time that 128 covers. So it's looking at the 10 years from now. The reason why we're looking at those out-year projects is, although this is an annual plan, we update the growth projects every year to flow into the development contributions policy so that we use the most updated costs. Otherwise, we are putting council in a position where it is under-calculating the development contribution charge, which will just increase the amount that subsequently we will need to move from DC funded debt to rate funded debt. So what we try to do is to always keep those long-term capital projects as current as possible, so that we're collecting sufficient development contributions, or as best we can. So that's the underlying reason why we're looking at this longer term picture. What we're seeing is a number of reasons why these projects are increasing, and these are the particular projects this time. There will be others in future years for similar reasons. One reason is around the pricing and market capacity. So in terms of some of the tenders that we've been putting to market, we're seeing on some a lower number of tenderers, and in some the costs that are coming through the tender process are significantly higher than what we had budgeted. What we're seeing is projects that are regular and repetitive and relatively sort of simple, so things like renewals of wastewater pipes, roading rehabs, things that we do day in, day out, seem to have not as much shift in terms of their costs. Things that are unusual, that we don't do very often, that are much higher risk for the construction company, and probably have a limited number of people who have done that type of work. Might have to be a larger firm, so things like the Waiari treatment plants and the trunk mains, those types of projects are coming in significantly over cost. On a number of occasions, these costs have been reviewed, and some of them went through the Housing Infrastructure Fund process, so we costed them in-house. We used external costing people to look at them who are in the national market, and then they were also peer reviewed by the cost people that MB engaged to review in terms of the HIF. So they've had quite a lot of review around them, and then still when we put them out to the market, those prices are higher. So I think that's really an issue around capacity in the market. Paul and Marty and I have had some conversation around that, and we've talked to the other growth councils who are doing these similar types of projects. They're experiencing similar things. So we're looking to commission a piece of work to just understand what is the sort of pipeline of project, what is the market doing, and how are these trends likely to continue, etc. So just to get a bit more of a handle on that, and hopefully try to work with Hamilton and Auckland around that. So we've just been having some conversations around that in the last week. The second area where we're seeing costs increase is, and we remember through the LTP, we talked to you about the confidence level attached to the budgets for projects. And as a project moves from a concept point of view to a preliminary design to a detailed design, our understanding of the project improves and the costs associated with that improves. Normally when you're at something at a concept design, you would add a significant contingency. We don't tend to do that, because then we would put 40 to 50% contingencies across all of our projects, and that's not something that we want to do. But we are seeing on some, and again it tends to be those rather unusual large one-off type projects. So Papamoa East Interchange is a really good example. As we've been doing the planning through the structure planning, we've been thinking much more around multimodal and future proofing. So we're moving, as we do that, from the concept design into the preliminary design, and having a lot more thinking going into that. The costs are increasing, and then we just need to do quite a lot more analysis around options, and then move later on into detailed design. So the budgets was in the very early concept design stage, and now as we move into that preliminary design for that project, the costs have increased quite significantly. And the third area is really around the resilience. So again, this is coming out in terms of the Eastern Corridor, in terms of Te Tumu. Been doing a lot of work around liquefaction, and trying to understand how the infrastructure in that area would fare, and what do we need to do to protect the infrastructure and the houses that are going to be dealt with in that area. So quite new thinking that hasn't been around previously, and we're looking at the cost to stabilise the ground and to stabilise the assets and to meet all of the requirements under the regional policy statement in terms of resilience. Again, that's driving additional cost into those infrastructure costings. Again, we need to do further work around, are there other options, are there more cost-effective options? But at this point in time in our design and thinking process, those are what the costs are. And because we don't want to end up in a situation where we end up transferring DC funded debt to rate funded debt, it's appropriate to put those costs in at this point in time. So those are probably the key drivers. And they are all impacting on the balance sheet situation. So we'll talk a little bit more probably about this, but at a national level, some of these issues for growth councils, because these projects that are increasing in costs are all growth projects. So they are the Papamoa East Interchange, the Waiari Water Treatment Plant, the upgrades to the Timanga Wastewater Plant, and the stormwater associated with the Te Tumu growth area. So they are all substantive investments to increase infrastructure to bring housing supply and business land supply on stream. The government has recognised through the urban growth agenda that these are national issues in terms of the capacity of local government, both in terms of funding and financing for growth. There are a number of streams of work underway at a national level that we have been actively involved with. There is the Crown Infrastructure Partnership model where there are financing arrangements through the private sector, and that has rolled out in Milldale and Auckland. And we are in conversations with Crown Infrastructure partners and developers to identify whether some of these growth areas could go through that process. The benefit of that is that that would move the debt for those assets off the balance sheet of council and relieve some of our debt pressure. There are some other initiatives as well looking at funding and financing options that we are involved with that Treasury are working on. And then you also have the Productivity Commission work, which has identified that the funding and financing arrangements for local government and particularly for growth councils are not sustainable, and seeking some feedback and on that in terms of what are the issues and how might they be resolved. So we do know that in the pipeline there are potentially some tangible and real options to deal with the challenges of the costs associated with infrastructure, but at the moment we don't know when and how and to what scale they will come to fruition. We know that the issues around cost escalation, resilience, and as we move from concept to preliminary to detailed design, while they've surfaced on these projects, they will surface on others. And we know that the market in terms of capacity is probably going to get tighter, not less, when we look at nationally around the infrastructure projects. And so we're just thinking about the prudency of all of that and thinking what is a prudent way forward for this council given those challenges that are on the horizon. So that's probably a summary of that.
So at that point, probably the only other thing that I would add is when we did the long-term plan, you'll be aware that we did do some smoothing of the capital program in the early years, reflecting the fact that there is pressure on the sector, not just Tauranga, but the sector to deliver. That smoothing in the 2020 annual plan has been increased up to $70 million, but we've been reluctant to continue that through the life of the 10-year plan, given the fact that we need to recognise the ability for the sector to deliver and make some adjustment in terms of that capacity model. So at that point, I'll open it for questions.
Questions, and because it's a big topic, it might extend into a little bit of discussion as well. I think we've got to spend the time necessary to get through this. Councillor Clout and then Councillor Kurak.
Thank you very much. So I've got 4 very specific questions, so I'll be as quick as I can. So the first one is, you talk about resilience. Now, is that being driven by the Regional Council and the RPS, or is this something that we as a council have consciously decided to engage in? Because obviously we know there is big costs associated with it.
Is effectively driven by the regional policy statements, and a lot of that work came from the Christchurch work. So some of those elements weren't previously incorporated into the RPS.
Thank you. Second question, when did we last have a debt retirement levy, and for how long, what level was it?
So we introduced it 2009 off memory, and I'm just just going from memory, it was around 4 to 5 years and around $4 million in terms of the total value of that. But that would need to confirm that.
Thank you. Third question, what are the implications of us staying in that red zone for those 4 years? We obviously know there are implications with the interest rates we'd be charged, but would this ever get past audit, or would, as long as we explained it, could we go ahead with that?
It would need to be tested, and it would need to be tested through a long-term plan process to do it. And what I would say, when we had the audit qualification in 2009, was for that very reason, that we were actually breaching those limits. So I would hazard a guess that nothing would change from their perspective from that. Probably the other thing to note is in terms of our borrowing is now through the local government funding agency, which in terms of an actual breach of limits will actually trigger a repayment of debt under their current policies.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. So it's pretty serious, clearly. And finally, on page 10, paragraph 18, it talks about the capital program for 2019-20 is 280 million, but that doesn't match up with the figure on page 15 of the actual table, which shows it at 188. So if we can have that clarified, please.
Just ask Sharita.
The capital program in the table shows less vested assets and less land sales. So it's the net NCAP really.
Paul, the financial risk, as you termed it earlier, is basically around the revenue to debt ratio and the potential breach, isn't it? It's not the level of the debt, it's the consequences of breaching that in terms of the local government funding agency in particular. So is there any opportunity to appeal to the funding agency to appreciate what's happening in the market, as Christine alluded to, in terms of these escalation in prices and therefore budget adjustments, to somehow accommodate the growth councils?
So those conversations have happened. The initial reaction of the local government funding agency was a fairly blunt no, and probably the big thing to note with that is that any breach at a local government of one council impacts on all council members that are borrowing from there, because it effectively potentially impacts on the credit rating of the local government funding agency, which has a borrowing cost flow on from that. And the other point to note is the conversation has actually happened at a central government level, and the desired direction is to prefer to look at these alternative funding and financing models rather than move the ratios, which is why there's a lot of work going on in that space at the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. To the Chief Executive, acknowledge the hopeful conversations to happen in the future, but dealing with the strict reality of where we're at now, would we be able to get a menu of discretionary projects which we could defer or not do in order to get below that red zone? And in terms of discretionary projects, I think everybody would have a different definition of that. I would be thinking some of the growth projects are non-discretionary. I'd be sort of thinking to the level of library, eyesight, recobbling Elizabeth Street, etc. as discretionary. So is that able to be done as part of a package of trying to deal with that reality later in those later years?
Yeah, it's possible to do that. I think I'd ask Paul perhaps to comment on the impact of those and what sort of quantum we'd need to try and find, if you like, to have an impact on this, a meaningful impact.
Thank you. So we've done a little bit of work around looking at what, and obviously it's not a staff decision in terms of what those projects would be. But looking at the type of projects that you mentioned, you know, firstly to note that we need to basically pull that $128 million out in terms of the number, so it is a big number that we need to extract out there. And the work that we've done would signal that you could potentially get, removing all of those projects would get you just below the line. So it's still quite a, you know, into sort of like correct. Well, and to caveat that, like, it's not for our decision to make as to what that's obviously elected members, but just looking at the non-hard infrastructure growth type projects, it still is quite a large capital program.
Thanks. Just to clarify, first of all, the figures we have in front of us are based on assumptions of the debt being on our books. It's not, you know, this is not looking at any of the CIP stuff and that, correct?
That's correct. So it's the current model, including HIF debt on our books.
Okay. Christine, you mentioned work being commissioned to look at trends going forward, the issue with, you know, capacity and all the rest, the impact on all that. And we've had some discussions here about what happens if we get into a recession and that sort of thing changes. Can that work also address any evidence historically of the last recession? How long a window might have appeared where you had some opportunities for some cheaper tendering or something? I'm a bit sceptical that it occurs for very long, given what's going on in New Zealand. But can that work, sort of, because we need some facts on some of that, really, to if we're going to lean on that as a way of deferring and waiting for a better opportunity.
Yeah. So at this point, we're just in early discussions with the University of Waikato in terms of sort of their research arm being able to do some of this work for us. So there's no reason why we can't include that in the scope. We haven't defined the scope yet.
Personally, it's something we should, you know, have some data analysis on. I can only remember anecdotally kind of what happened coming out of the GFC and that sort of thing, and, you know, and what prices did over a trend. And we're not just looking at building a house and sort of hanging on for 3 years and hoping to get a bargain. We're dealing with so much stuff that I'm not sure it really offers us much of a solution.
And just if I'd point out too that while you were looking at these specific projects that add up to 128 million, it's really about the direction of travel of those projects, and that they will likely apply to the rest of the portfolio. So those, but to the extent of that we don't know. So those ones make up about 5% of the overall, you know, the capital program. So it's only a small proportion, and if you continue to see that across the rest, and then to what extent can that be balanced out by things like the Crown Infrastructure Partners, and that's really the unknown. We were saying you might want to think about some prudency in how you set your revenue targets, knowing those things are sitting there and we don't have enough clarity on them at the moment.
You mentioned, you know, cost escalations, and I heard you saying a number of things that were contributing to that, not just the fact that the market's sort of over capacity or under capacity in delivering, because some of it is our redesigning, some of it is trying to address the government's change to multimodal and all that, which adds costs. So when we hear about a project has just gone up 20 million or whatever, we do need to know why, rather than just assume it's that market thing. You can give us some.
So yes, in terms of individual projects, Te Tumu is a really good example of that. There's a whole mix of things in there, from change in design to future-proofing to multimodal to resilience, and each of them are adding cost into the mix, and then sort of our current market assessment. So, you know, absolutely the point, there's not just one factor in here, there are multiple factors with different reasons, and we do have a lot more work about then, given we've now got updated costs for some of these, and some of them only come in quite recently, we need to go back and reassess, is there another way we can deliver this level of service in a more cost-efficient manner and value engineer them, but we haven't had the time to do that because some of this technical work is just coming in at this point, and for other projects the technical work will come in 3 and 6 and 12 months' time.
Just the other point I'd add to that is that conversation is also being pushed through in terms of the Productivity Commission conversations as well, that those cost pressures aren't just us, they're sector issues that effectively need to be considered when we're looking at that funding and financing model.
So further to providing relief to the cost-benefit ratio and the Crown Infrastructure partner option, if you call it that, and the uncertainty there, therefore we have to look at other measures. At what point would we have a degree of certainty with the developers? And the other question is, what do you see as the potential negative a developer might see in terms of taking that option or opportunity?
So we have met with the developers and they were quite keen on the opportunity because they understand the pressure on the Tauranga City Council's balance sheet. We've been telling them that for some 10 years now, making it really clear that we can't fund all of this infrastructure. I think the thing with the Crown Infrastructure Partner model is it takes the debt off the balance sheet, but at the end of the day, the person who's living in the house or buying the property still pays. So whether they pay the cost of that infrastructure through an increased rate or through a charge that's through the Crown Infrastructure Partner model, there's still a cost to that household in one way or another. The benefit is that the council doesn't have the debt revenue challenges for the end user. It's just a different form of payment and a different party that they're paying to get the infrastructure to enable them to have a dwelling and live in that dwelling.
If I could just add, the other benefit is at the moment, as we know, the development contribution model often isn't a perfect model, and therefore residual risk sits back with general ratepayer. It doesn't under the Crown Infrastructure Partners model.
Just to follow up on that, but the actual net cost or the total cost to the homeowner is not necessarily any more, as I understand it, reading the document that Councillor Brown distributed, because that was the question asked. Is that correct?
Obviously there's going to be some element of borrowing cost difference within there. The numbers around Milldale, which can't be disclosed, but they're favourable. They're not. It's not a huge margin difference.
And finally, just in terms of the comment Chief Executive made about a meaningful impact in terms of when we talked about trimming some of the more discretionary capex. So when we look at the proposed debt retirement levy, what would be meaningful in terms of the amount we would need to start collecting to bring down that ratio?
We have that table on your page, which happy to discuss. I'll just run through it at a high level now. If I work from the top, the base scenarios is as per the report. The second block of numbers there is, oh sorry, that's the A4. Sorry. The second block is a 320,000 increase, which is really to reflect that when we were working with the numbers, we had a Treasury forecast of 1.7% inflation. Last year it's now 1.9%, so the 320 takes it back to that 1.9% number. You can see a relatively minimal impact on the overall numbers. The next is a $1 million increase, which still is in the red but not as red. The next is a $3 million increase, again still in the red but a little bit better. And then the last option, which takes us back to the long-term plan level, which is the $5.5 million, with the exception of 2025, is actually, albeit very close to the limits in 23 and 24. And as Christine said, there's certainly still risk around those, but it does put us within there. So in terms of doing, as my first comment is, it's not resolved in an annual plan year. It's really setting a direction and a conversation with the community about what that might be.
Clarification on this A4 handout. The numbers on the left hand in terms of percentage increase in rates, is that additional to or total?
It's the net increase. The one thing I'd point out is that with the debt retirement options, it doesn't include in later years the introduction of it's after the curbside introduction of curbside recycling, so that's not included within that number. But it's that is the total percentage increase shown.
Well, thank you.
So what they would be, so you know, $1 million is around about point. I'd have to get the exact number, 0.6%. 5.5 is circa 3 to 3.5%. Confirm the exact number. So option 3, the 3 million, the 4.5%, that would be around the 0.7% rates debt retirement levy to give the $1 million. So our rating level 1.5 times is approximate at this point.
Does anybody want to continue with this? Because my question's going back a little bit, because it's a very good conversation. No? Not just yet, all right. I'm not sure if it's Paul or Christine. Just to sort of go back to the capital program and the, so next year's $188 million. And I'm not sure if you've explained it, but I think if you could just sort of put it perhaps in a slightly different context, that with the complexity of that capital program and the interrelationships of all of those items, is it simplistic to say that, I guess I'm saying, oh, there are one of two scenarios. One is that instead of bearing in mind the context of this, is that the current year we're probably not going to deliver about 15% of what we budgeted for, but that 33 million. So if we assume that goes forward, should we be tendering for 115% of what we could, so that we get it down to 100 and we deliver what we want because we've got the money? Or secondly, saying, should we have a plan B for, say, discretionary expenditure, whereas that if we don't spend the 100%, so in other words we only spend 85% as we are this year, then that additional money goes into discretionary. Is that simplistic?
A couple of things. One is that we've assumed that we won't deliver $70 million of that from a funding perspective in the annual plan year. In terms of the discretionary and moving things around, I think the issue with that becomes is the issue is actually a 10-year problem, in particular in the middle 5 years. So any movement that just moves things between years in that first 5 years will still encounter the same problem, and it might be what year you hit it in is the only thing that actually changes. So I'd be saying it's pretty limited in terms of what can move. The question becomes, is there anything in there that actually would either be funded differently or move out completely?
But in terms of the ability to move, you have passed a resolution when you adopted the LTP that gave the Chief Executive the ability to move projects within the 3-year window. So we do, if we find something can't proceed for whatever reason, and there is capacity, or for some other reason another project becomes more important, there is the pull forward option for the Chief Executive with certain reporting options. So there is flexibility within the whole capital program as well, so that we can modify what we're actually delivering. But I agree with Paul, this is about the total to be delivered in the 10 years, even if things move backwards or forwards. You know that what you need to deliver to provide capacity for growth puts you up against the debt to revenue ratio issue. That's really where it ends you.
Yeah, thank you for loosening up standing orders, Your Worship. Some observations. We pulled the trigger on the debt retirement levy last time because of the GFC. We were in recession. The idea that we're pulling it when we're not in recession suggests to me that we got one bullet less if a recession comes, or we're going to have to double down on it. So I'm concerned that we're in that space already in an environment where the country is not in recession. I think there is a conversation that needs to be had with the community, and I'm concerned that the focus is yet again very much on CapEx, and I understand why, but I think it needs to be broadened. But also I think it needs to be clarified. We've already had one elected member go in to the media recently and suggest there are some projects that could be kicked to touch. The question is, while these numbers may resonate with a community that's worried about its rates increases, as I am, what would the effect of that be? I would like to see the community informed as to, in terms of our capital spend, in terms of our projects, and in terms of the large operational areas, a breakdown of what is sort of BAU core infrastructure, what is growth core infrastructure, and what is, to use this very loose word, discretionary, and then broken down by what is ratepayer funded and what effectively is, you know, funded by some other means, development contributions or whatever. It may be that the community needs to be aware that it's the core infrastructure costs that are pushing and putting the pressure on, and a conversation, highly politicized, poorly informed, that influences electoral outcomes may in fact not actually be relevant to addressing the substantive numbers. And I don't think we've got that clear, simple picture either in front of us here in a way that's easy to communicate to the community, nor have the community got that picture. And without that picture, they can't make informed decisions. I come back to it. If what's driving these things is core infrastructure that has to be ratepayer funded, right? So water treatment plants that are needed for the current city, that's a different question to if what's driving it is actually we've got a debt to revenue ratio, but the funding is actually coming from development contributions, versus if what's driving it is in fact, you know, wildly optimistic, transformational, discretionary projects. We need to get clear on that, and we need to make sure our community's informed about that. What I don't want to see is over the next 3-4 months an ill-informed discussion with evidence-free accusations of what the problems are, sort of polluting the community's understanding and corrupting the democratic process going forward as well. I think there's more discussion to be had, but we need, I think, some more summary of really what's driving these things. And we've heard that staff have looked at discretionary, but I haven't got those numbers in front of me. So I don't know whether that's a big number or not a big number, and I'd like to see that. It would be helpful for me, and I believe it would be helpful for our community.
Just to respond, just firstly on the GFC thing, I think one important point to note is that the thing that happened in between then and now was the actual disposal of Route K, which actually did have a fairly big balance sheet impact, which has in some ways, buffered the issue effectively with that. So that's one thing with that. In terms of the BAU and the core, and as I said before, yes, we've done some work around that, and happy to share what that looks like. One of the things which will be difficult in that conversation is effectively getting a really clear understanding of what actually it means in terms of the BAU, and that's why we've suggested that conversation really should take place as part of more of a long-term plan process, because we need to deal with it as a 10-year plan effectively issue going forward. So suggestion at this point was really that process will happen, but just the timing of when that process will happen, because the conversation with the community in some ways can be informed in terms of a big chunk of it is related to the core, but there will be a big conversation about what that actually is defined as.
Councillor Kurak, Baldock and Morris, and Mason and Brown.
Big lineup. So given that we're in this predicament because of the local government funding agency and its policies in terms of lending, the local government funding agency is owned by local government councils. In fact, they've got the representatives of the councils on the board. And I would imagine that they'd have a fair bit of clout. But unfortunately, I assume that the majority, I'm not sure of the makeup of the members of that board, but I'm assuming that a number of them would be from the growth councils who are in the same predicament, I imagine, what Auckland is, because they're looking at the Crown Infrastructure Partners opportunities to try and minimise its debt revenue ratio to bring it down to meet the local government funding agency requirements. But given that supposedly we should have a whole lot of influence in what those policies are set at, unless the members or representatives go along and just say aye and just tick the boxes what the executive want of the local government agency, funding agency, I would think that these discussions would be happening, and why aren't they coming down stronger on the organisation and its chief executive? Say, come on guys, let's take a realistic look at this situation. Why do we have to go to extreme measures? Not that they're extreme, like looking at other opportunities such as Crown Fibre. Why don't we just change our policy? Take away the threat that they'll withdraw all the funding if you happen to exceed the percentage rate by 1 or 2% or whatever it may be, because in actual fact it's ridiculous. The debt, when Councillor Robson alludes to in future years, is a growth debt, infrastructure and developers and new housing there. To me, the risk is low because of growth, particularly in growth areas. That's not going to stop. We are undersupplied in terms of housing. That's going to go on for many years. There'll be demand there. There'll be people paying rates to service that debt into the future. I see very little risk. And why the funding agency is so strong on that, I don't understand. I think the three councils, particularly Auckland, Hamilton and Tauranga, should go down there, and with elected members in tow as well, and just have a really strong conversation, because we shouldn't be in this situation. It's just ridiculous. If it was doubling the percentage, going from 250 to 500%, I would understand, but a marginal 5, or what's the maximum there? The exceedance, 10 or whatever it is, it's just ridiculous. And I'll just leave it at that. I just don't understand it.
Just make a couple of comments. I think, one of the fundamental principles of the local government funding agency was set up to actually be at a rating agency perspective of at or near Crown, and it's rated by both S&P and Fitch, and their fundamental what they're looking at is effectively that 250%, because it is general obligation debt and not specific financing like the Milldale models and so forth. So it is restricted from that perspective in terms of what it can do. So it's not so much a conversation with the local government funding agency. It's trying to get Standard & Poor's to Fitch to actually re-rate in a different way to actually keep that that credit quality in place. Otherwise, what every council borrowing through that funding agency would have would be an increase in their borrowing costs immediately if that rating level went down. So that's where the issue really is. It's not so we have had the conversations of LGFA, and it's not so much that conversation, it's the conversation with the rating agencies that actually would need to actually move that.
Helpful. So where does the funding agency get its money? Why couldn't it go direct to the market rather than going through the wider market?
It does go to the market. It goes both to the domestic and international market.
So where does the, like Standard & Poor's, etc., that rating in terms of when the funding agency goes to the punter out there to get money directly from us or internationally or whatever, given that it's underwritten by property and local government, if I was an investor and looking at putting funds into the local government funding agency, it's like the Crown, it's pretty secure, and whether the Standard & Poor's gives a lower rating, by 1 minus or 1 letter, it's not going to make that much difference in terms of its ability to borrow from the market to then lend on to local government.
Its ability to borrow, it's the cost of the borrowing, because the cost of the borrowing will increase at a lower rating level.
But I'm saying if they're borrowing from the public, well,
Paul is not trying to justify it, he's just saying how it is. That's more the issue. Yeah.
Probably just one more comment I'd make is like one of the ideas around Crown Infrastructure Partners and infrastructure funding and financing work stream is actually taking debt to more of a project specific level, which does give you the ability to actually have a higher ratio than 250%. The restriction at the moment is that general obligation debt, and it's a very big conversation with the raters more than anything.
Because that's the issue here, isn't it? When you look at the opportunities of the Crown 5, not Crown 5, but whatever it's called, Crown Infrastructure, because we're talking about horizontal infrastructure, most of it. So when you're looking at debt revenue ratios, you've got a whole lot of debt, but very little, operational expenditure required apart from debt servicing, depreciation, etc. Quite different to some of the discretionary projects like a library, which has a lot of extra. And that's the situation that we need to address in terms of the growth councils, which other councils don't have that problem when we're trying to meet that debt revenue ratio.
We're not in this predicament because of the LGFA. And suggesting that Crown debt is safer debt. It is all dependent upon the state of the books. You could say in Greece it's Crown debt. So it's a very different scenario. It is because of these regulations, these requirements upon us, that they can go and get this funding. And even if, Rick, there was a discussion had, it's not going to be the solution in the short term for us. We need to shift the conversation. After we listen to a speech or two, you wonder where we're going to end up. We need to be clear, Councillor Robson, with the community. I believe we have been clear in our LTP last year. We were very clear that really the major challenges facing us is core infrastructure debt, and yet we weren't. We went out politically, and it seems like, I don't know what the comment you made about somebody talking about these other projects that could solve our problems, but we were very political then. And what we have tended to do is that every time we do an LTP and then we have these debt increases out these rate increases out there, and then every time we get to an annual plan we try and pull them back again. We are not dealing responsibly with what is on our balance sheet and on our projections because we keep trying to push these rates down. We have to be honest with our community that this is a growing city. It has huge infrastructure challenges, and we've got to get on with the job. And I think we need to get around the discussion this morning about this potential debt retirement levy as a means of addressing it. We don't have a lot of options, and it isn't a matter of just stopping a library or some streetscapes. They're not big enough to get us back where we need to be. We have to abide by these LGFA requirements, and even if they weren't LGFAs, they would be the rating agencies' requirements, and we'd suddenly lose our ratings and we'd be paying more in interest. So I hope we can get into some discussion this morning and not just talk about hopeful ideas about how we can deal with what's in front of us.
Yeah, we sort of have gotten into discussion of it because I did mention that it wasn't strictly questions. We were allowed, because I think it's so important. That's why we're having discussions in amongst our questions. Councillor Morris.
Hey, thank you. Not sure to one of the senior staff. A colleague earlier in the discussion referred to growth, infrastructure, debt, and the rates impact on that. And I think Waiari was one of the projects mentioned. That's a $145 million project. Can you just briefly tell us the proportion of that project that is rates funded? Obviously, we're financing it through the Housing Infrastructure Fund, but we're due to actually start collecting development contributions soon for it. What's the proportion, a general answer will be, my understanding is very small compared to the development contributions, citywide development contributions for that.
From my understanding, it's 100% growth funded. There's percent. Tamanga has a mixture of growth because it's got some renewal in there, but Waiari is all for growth. It's not small. Pipamara East 5% for PEI.
Just the other thing to note on that is that we do always talk about the capital side of that. There isn't an operational cost implication effectively that flows through, that obviously the growth population isn't there to absorb up front. Charging. Yep, that's right. That's right. Yes.
And I think we see in the DC report later that we're talking about a $4,000 DC across the city for Waiari. Is that what you're projecting?
Check the numbers have been constantly moving, so Andy's probably the best to give you an update, and we've also had some conversations around signalling the increase in Waiari well ahead of time, so that people who are doing planning and building know that there's going to be a substantive increase. But Andy can give the details.
Yeah, we can come to more detail later, but the numbers suggest that we need to increase the water citywide development contribution by $4,000 as the result of funding the Waiari water treatment plant. That doesn't mean it's a $4,000 charge for that plant, because there's already a charge there, so it will be more than $4,000 for that particular project.
Can I just ask, it might sound a bit of a simple type question, but if most of this need for increased revenue comes from...
Did you accidentally summon me?
No? Oh, that's Siri. Yeah. That's open to all sorts of interpretation. Okay, where does the... and then, but most of it's being covered by development contributions. That's why I can't sort of understand why the need for the increased rates revenue if this growth is being covered by development contributions, and I just don't quite understand it. It probably is me.
So the reason is that debt sits on our balance sheet at this point in time in the absence of any other solution being in place. So because that debt sits on our balance sheet, it becomes a borrowing covenant issue for us. So the work that's being done around those other models is looking at removing it off balance sheet, but we don't have that confirmed at this point.
When the money comes back, there's suddenly a big drop in the need for money, is there? And we get a rates decrease. Is that how it...
We get a debt decrease when the money comes in, but that money comes in over like a 50-year period. So
hence the Crown Infrastructure Partners, if that was to come through, would just solve a lot of the problems. Okay, Councillor Mason and Brown.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just 2 points. Just quickly, that we've been sort of bandying the word recession around. I think it's dangerous to do that. It's got all kinds of implications to it. I think, if I may suggest, we use the word downturn. It's a bit better. A recession is defined as 2 successive quarters of GDP decline, whereas a downturn is more broad, and also it's a local downturn is probably more accurate and more better for us to use if we do use that word. So just a suggestion. The second thing is that you know, we keep on going into this rates versus debt or DCs, and that we do have a binary kind of mentality, I think, around this. And whilst we are, and I think this conversation is very good because it again reinforces that. And I do think we need to increase our degree of sophistication of solutions, development solutions as we go. And in specific, what Paul's mentioning, the piece of work that you're doing around what is core, and perhaps ranking importance of core infrastructure and all that. But at the same time, you know, I think we're all pretty aware that many other cities around the world are growing very, very fast and have in the past, and there's lots of historical precedent about both core infrastructure and shall we call it discretionary or social infrastructure, whatever you might call it. They also go ahead as well. So I guess what I'm asking is that can some of debate's not going to go away until we address this issue. And can part of your work address that as well? What can we learn from other cities and how they've funded those things using perhaps a broader net?
That's exactly the thinking that's going into those other models that are actually taking place. Like, a lot of them use a more project-specific financing model than what New Zealand uses in that perspective. And Milldale is an example of moving more to an off-balance sheet model that actually allows that. And you know, the issue to date has been in terms of, as Christine pointed out, is, you know, someone is still paying for that at the end of the day. Question is who's paying it? Is it aligned to the incentives for development? Is it not putting residual risk back onto general ratepayer, and so on and so on? So that's all part of that conversation, and looking at other countries' experience in terms of how they fund infrastructure in a growing city. But it's building on that experience. And Milldale is a direct model that's come out of other countries effectively in terms of how that's being funded.
So
are you saying that, are you absolutely in your mind that it is soft and hard infrastructure that we're talking, not just, because the examples we give are always come back to us as hard infrastructure, but there's more to the city than that.
Not necessarily, but at the moment, because it's all in one bucket of general obligation debt, we can't make the distinction. Having those tools that allow us to deliver some of that other infrastructure in an off-balance sheet model in a different way allows capacity of councils to make elected member decisions in terms of that other infrastructure.
In terms of the social infrastructure, we've been advocating hard for the return of development contributions for social infrastructure. They were removed, so that's something we're actively focusing on. And in terms of the international examples, so Infrastructure New Zealand has for the last few years had international delegations going from New Zealand. Both Paul and I participated in that. The absolute purpose of that is to go and have a look at what's happening in other jurisdictions and whether some of those learnings can be translated. And interesting, the people that we're working on in terms of CIP and the infrastructure funding and financing work stream, many of those around the table in the workshop are people who have been on those international study tours, and that's what's going into that thinking. So absolutely that's happening in a coordinated way across the Growth Councils, MB, Treasury and Crown Infrastructure Partners.
And just to further that, the conversations that we're having at a Treasury DIA level include a push that it's more than just a model for the hard stuff. So that's continuing.
Thank you, and apologies for the lateness. We're allowed 3/4 of an hour to get here. Should have been here well before that. In our LTP last year, we had 3 recommendations, and they were to direct staff to explore alternative target rate options for complementing or replacing the differential, report back to Council on next annual plan, resolve to set a resilience targeted rate for water, wastewater, stormwater, roading and emergency, and direct staff to explore target rate options for accommodation providers, report back in next annual plan. So those were 3. When will those 3 pieces of work come to us?
The resilience rate was included in the long-term plan, so that one was dealt with, and we spoke in November or December about an approach of saying that we're better to actually make sure that we've got the direction and the clarity before we actually have the conversation on the targeted rates, because it should follow the benefit. So we need to be clear in terms of making sure that those projects are actually addressing that. So it won't be for this annual plan, it'll be once we've done that piece of work in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just going back to the recommendations. Look, we haven't covered the use of fees and charges yet. We're going to do that later, aren't we? Yep. Okay. But in terms of the word baseline is in the recommendation there. Approve the high-level financials as the baseline. So, what does baseline mean? Does that mean the starting point, and one goes up from there, or down from there, down from there, up? Is it?
We'd be suggesting up.
Okay.
Baseline effectively is what the fully funded budget is actually looking at being achieved. But what we're saying is then a debt retirement would sit over and above that, recognising those future pressures.
And do you have the topic we've been discussing now? But do you have a firm figure for B? In terms of your recommendation for the debt retirement levy, is it? Yeah, what is it?
So that would be the A4 sheet in terms of what that looks like, and like
which number is it?
Well, if we start, the most financially prudent position is to go to the higher number. but you know, that is not a member decision in terms of what that looks like.
Yeah, just on the DC conversation, and I know we come to it a bit later, but Christine and Paul, we've been around long enough. We started the, you know, growth pays for growth mantra some time ago and realised that it just didn't work. And I've been at the table enough times where we've transferred significant millions to rate funding, because no matter how well you try and estimate, you end up, you know, the DCs just don't cover it. And I hear you saying we're trying to do the job better. We always have been trying to estimate, but you have to justify what you estimate, and you know, otherwise the developers come in and challenge what we're putting onto DCs. I'm also concerned that we just can't keep front loading those costs onto the end user, which is the home buyer, because the cost of housing in the city is going up anyway, astronomically, because of demand and so on. So I see this debt retirement levy as being more than just a debt retirement levy, because we know we're going to have to fund some of this through general rates. Like Waiari, for example, this is a water supply issue. Why should only the people buying a house from this day on be paying for that supply? You know, yes, they are getting that supply. They are you know, the exacerbators in the supply, but the whole city has to just look at, you know, this supply of fresh potable water. So I'd like to, I think it might be, it might help us to just see how much money we've had to transfer from DCs to rates over the past sort of 10 years, you know, because it would help us realise just how much we are having to do this anyway, and it may be better to do it up front rather than tail end.
Fraser's sitting at the back there. Have you got, it's approximately 40.
This is DC funded debt.
But that's in what year?
Yeah, so 14 million has been transferred with a further 28 to transfer, so 42 million at the moment. Yep.
That's in this year or what?
No. That's over a 10-year period, I think, or yeah.
I think we transferred a big chunk for Bethlehem though. Yeah,
we have. So that's when the project's finished. That's transferred, and I think that's one of the attractions of these other models, is they actually do particularly mitigate that risk of any under collection going back to rate funded debt.
I'm not sure how to read this. Given there are breaches until with the revised figures for 22, then on to 23 and 26, and we don't know what's going to happen with Crown Infrastructure and the Productivity Commission work and other pieces of work, is it you're suggesting that we put this debt retirement levy in now to smooth it out, and then it will be addressed in the next LTP?
Yeah, I'll keep going forward. So yes, what we're saying, from a prudency point of view, you know that these things are coming, and we know that the scale of them is more than 100 million in terms of increased costs. We don't know yet whether and how we'll be able to pick up CIP in the scale of that. And so we're saying, in terms of prudency, given that these risks and issues are on the horizon in terms of your balance sheet, it would make sense to at least take a step towards starting to deal with that gap, rather than going to a reduced rate level from what you had in the LTP and then potentially having to go even higher again. So and then trying to deal with most of these issues through the next LTP process.
And the other thing I think that's important in that is it does send a very consistent message in terms of that central government conversation that there is a significant issue with Growth Council funding.
Yeah, Paul, can you sort of explain why? Because when you look at it, you wonder why. If you go to the highest level of the debt retirement level on the bottom, yet 2021, it's only pulled it down, you know, 0.4. So, and you can anticipate whoever sitting at this table in a year's time, faced with going to the community with an 8.4% 5% rate increase there is going to do what we do, try and squeeze it down. So why does it only affect such a small change in the years going forward?
The answer to that is because it has a compounding effect. So an extra $5.5 million is an extra $55 million over a 10-year period. So that money is affecting both the top of the line and the bottom of the line, because it's putting more revenue and it's reducing debt.
To actually have its effect, huh? Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think we did a great job explaining our situation to the community when we did the last LTP. I think the community was decidedly poorly informed about the nature of this, because all these problems, every one of them, was known at that point, and we didn't go out and effectively communicate the situation to them. So we did not do a good job in terms of getting our community to understand how this business works, and we repeatedly failed to do that. I come back to it that I do think that matrix is required. The key thing for me is, my concern is we are looking at the debt retirement levy, which 10 years out makes no difference to the rates increases. Concern one. Concern two, given when you look at what's been done in Milldale, there's not much scope for that having a significant impact on what we're doing if it's only about growth and packageable projects, because a lot of our stuff is in fact increasing debt from actually, renewing to a higher level for resilience purposes. It's about when we renew, the depreciation we've collected isn't sufficient because the market constraints have pushed the prices up, so we have to take on greater debt because we don't actually have funds available to replace decaying assets. And this is actually not something that's specific to growth councils. There are a lot of councils in New Zealand in this situation. My concern is that we are sort of hoping that a small, initiative around a debt retirement levy will substantively change things, and that things that are coming are going to have a significant impact. I think neither of those things are true when I look at the numbers. So I just want to make sure that any conversation that happens is informed, that we control, in a sense, and ensure that solid information is in our community, because I do fear that we're going to have conversations, and I think Councillor Baldock has been or some of his aspiration for the city, and I'm not criticising that, has been a victim in some ways of conversations that haven't been founded in solid data, right? I also am concerned yet again that we are looking at the big CapEx thing and we're not, we're distracted again. We're not looking at OpEx. There is growth funding we know DC's growth fund a lot of things. Councillor Morris has referred to it, so PEI and all the rest of it, but eventually those projects flow back into, and the OpEx flows back into our rates. And a significant part of our rates bill is our financing and depreciation costs, right? Depreciation costs, significant. We've got to get our head round the numbers that drive this city's finances. We've got to have a conversation with our community and communicate in such a way that our community understands these things. There is no point having a big debate about whether we have or have not a new tourist information centre, or whatever one wants to call it, in the Mount, if we spend a lot of governance time and a lot of community energy on a conversation that actually produces no substantive change to the critical issues. And that's my concern at this stage. I believe our community is smart enough if we are smart enough. If we get our head around our numbers and communicate it well, our community will respond in a sound and rational way. But I fear at the moment that we're going to a sort of knee-jerk response. Debt retirement levy this year, bit of a panic. It's already been pointed out, the red doesn't start for a few years. We do have an LTP starting before that period. I would just like to get us into a situation we have an informed debate that we share with the community. And I don't see that happening around this table. You know, and I go back to it, the last LTP, all these issues were here for the last LTP, and they were not properly canvassed with the community. The debate was around things like, well, you know, some nice to have infrastructure. It was amazing and disturbing at the same time.
Through you, Worship, if I may. I think Paul's already said that we can't fix this issue through this annual plan process. What we're doing is we're bringing, we think, one of the most significant issues to you, and that, firstly, I think we need to acknowledge it. Secondly, the fact we can't fix it, we can do something to signal that we are aware of it, and we can take a step towards addressing it. At least it's a signal, not only to our community, to government, that we've acknowledged it and we're taking a prudent step to try and address it, in the knowledge that there is a piece of work going on that essentially may address some or all of this issue for us through different funding mechanisms. I think there's so much uncertainty, so I think a step doesn't need necessarily to be moved straight to 7.5%. It could be a step that signals to our community that we acknowledge it, we're taking a step towards addressing that issue, and we're very keen to have that conversation and try and find the funding solutions that government and Treasury and the Growth Councils are working on. I think it's a very good conversation to have with our community.
If I may just follow up from that, and possibly to Paul, you know, if we take that step, whatever the percentage, it surely must signal something positive to the auditors when we go out with red in our 10-year plan, that we're not ignoring it, we're just, you know, we're doing what we can.
Absolutely. You know, audit don't look at the annual plan, so they're not going to. But in terms of that long-term signal, I think that is absolutely right. And I think just to pick up on Councillor Robson's point is that what we're also acknowledging the fact that whilst we knew those issues, the size and scale has probably been larger than what we did anticipate, because we would have brought those numbers to you in December otherwise. But there's 128 million more in there now than there was in December. So, yeah.
Just to follow up on that, there is a major issue in my view, and it became sort of public in 2013, and that is the quality of the information that is driving the decisions of this council. Right? The quality of our ERP or management information system, whatever you want to call it. We're 5 years, way past 5 years, when the issues around those systems at some level were sprung upon an incoming council and were, you know, informed in some way, but loosely and amateurishly, in my view, the community. We really need to get to a situation where these things. Want to put that marker down as well, because we're 5 years, way beyond 5 years since 2013, and you know, we've got a long way to go before we get to a situation where we don't get surprised to this order.
I think, you know, just to comment on that, is I don't think the system would have made any difference to this particular issue that we're facing. This is because of what we're seeing coming through the market changes, more detailed design, and the points that Christine. So I'll never disagree with you about the system issue, but as you know, but I don't think it would have made any difference to that number that's facing us now.
We're sort of saying at the moment, you know, we need to wait to an LTP. Now, there was a conversation late last year about whether we should be looking at an LTPA here, and I'm very much of the view that's the way we should have gone. But again, workload, resource capacity of the organisation, capability perhaps in some places, you know, sort of pushed us away from that. So we're now sort of constrained a little bit. It's a bit late to probably try and, you know, reopen that conversation. But I believe if we'd been better informed, that LTPA discussion may have gone my way, and we'd be addressing this in a far more fundamental way than we are now, which most people seem to accept as sticking plasters.
Yeah, it'll become obvious that Councillor Robson and I might debate all morning on these things. The suggestion that we didn't know these things, there are some things we didn't know which have changed since the LTP of last year, but we knew, and it was very clearly signalled to us by staff, that most of all of the rate increases in the LTP were growth related. They were things we could not do much about, and yet still Councillor Robson and others came in and tried to push the rates down to the rate cap and significantly contribute to the situation we are now in. The idea that in 2013 we didn't know anything is ridiculous. There was a move in the community about our debt, which led to quite a clean out in council, Councillor Robson being the beneficiary of, and many people stood for election based on the fact they would deal with the debt. Nothing much has changed because it isn't possible to do a lot about it, because we are what we are. We are a city faced with tremendous challenges on our balance sheet because of infrastructure that is required for growth. Misinformation occurs in the community all the time. We as elected members have a responsibility to try and counter that, not contribute to it. And there are people around this table who do contribute to it by their election campaigns, by the things they say in the media. We're probably the ones who know more than anyone as we sit here and are informed, and we need to make the decisions based on what we know. And we've got a decision, I believe, to make today, and I hope we'll get to a decision at some point.
I guess that part of that responsibility in making decisions is making sure that the community is informed and that there is debate around that. And so that you take, I think we've mentioned that a big problem that we've had as a council is taking people with us, and I think that's the thing we've got to try and do in conjunction with making our decisions.
Your Worship, just one if the staff, and maybe we can end on an agreement possibly, Larry, which would be nice. If the staff produce quality information which makes the picture very clear, and the community can access that directly via looking at our systems and accessing the reports, and that's communicated by our comms people, then the ability of elected members to traduce those realities for personal advantage or political gain disappears. My point is, you know, can we in some ways get better information circulated by staff, quality information, clearly designed to be consumed by our community to actually reduce the opportunity for ill-informed debates between councillors seeking to address their particular constituencies, whatever they are. The better the quality of the information produced by staff, the more accessible that is for our community, the less chance there is for politicians, for whatever reason, to traduce the conversations, surely.
Okay, we'll just adjourn for a much needed morning break, and then when we come back, I thought if we go through the other reports, make those decisions, come back to this and have a proper debate. Yes, yeah. Okay, so 10:45, yeah, 15 or so minutes, we'll start again, thanks. Okay, just resuming the meeting. Councillor Clout, did you want to that explained at the moment?
Oh, thank you. Just wanted to,
and
for the benefit of those that are watching, there's lots of millions of dollars here in terms of increased capital costs, but then there's some minuses as well which are being taken into account, and just want to get the staff to clarify that, particularly the $30 million capital delivery adjustment.
Through the chair, so the 30 million, this is effectively showing the movements between December 18 and where we are now in terms of the capital program. And what we've done with that 30 million adjustment is when we set the long-term plan, we had 70 million in the current financial year, 40 million and 40 million in terms of smoothing, recognising the fact that delivery was going to be an issue for us to actually achieve that. As we've added and updated the annual plan, we've just reassessed what that smoothing number or adjustment number should be, and therefore that has moved from 40 million to 70 million, i.e. the 30 million increase, which won't be funded in the 1920 year. It does come with an element of risk, which is if we are delivering those projects and we need to look at our borrowing resolutions that may occur during the year, but we're conscious that we certainly don't want to overfund effectively for that period.
Trying to get the microphone going. We'll go on to the rest of the agenda, park this, come back, and then make some decisions and further debate. So if we go on to our next agenda item, which is DC 33. Okay, and this does get on to the operational cost increases as well. So, did you want to speak to that, Paul? DC 33, page 57.
Just briefly, this document came to council just prior to Christmas, and a request was made for some changes to it. That's been now incorporated in there. The purpose of it is effectively showing the operation and capital spend by activity, and the flow on implications are included where there's major capital spend into the activity's operational cost model. So it's probably easier if it just there's a summary chart at the start of the pack which goes through the movement in operational cost, and probably the key highlight with that is the ever increasing move to capital type costs, so depreciation and interest becoming a much larger proportion of the cost base over the 10-year period, and the big movements certainly flowing out of that capital program. If we look at one example, for example, the transportation activity, the first page shows the split of the operational cost coming through on that activity. The second page shows over the 10-year plan, again, a breakdown of what that OPEX looks like relative to the capital program. And then the final page is probably the one that has the most information in terms of explaining by project the capital and operational costs coming through from the major projects within there. So I'll take any questions.
Paul, can you just tell us where the base track for Moel expenses are going to sit, because now the work's not going to happen until the next financial year. It was originally at a reserves fund. We know that there's been a huge increase in the cost of that project. So I'm looking at the Parks and Reserves page 73, and it's not mentioned on that page.
So what will happen with that project is that currently the budget sits, and I'm just looking at Sheree to confirm this, in the current financial year. That will be carried forward and updated as part of the new costings when they're firmer. So it will be included within the Parks and Rec activity, but the funding around risk management, because it's now largely seen as a capital project, we'd be suggesting that it is just funded through the normal debt process, because that risk management effectively is really no difference, except we're just using up the balance of that fund, but it would still just impact on debt anyway, so we'll just do it as a normal loan funded project with the updated costings when they come in.
Second question, under emergency management, we've got there, it relates to further tsunami evacuation sites, but there's no mention of the warning system and the work that may be happening around that. I know it's coming to us in a report in, I think, April, but there's no mention of it as a capital expense.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. So the in-house alarm alerting system is something that we had to make a decision last week as to whether or not we went to phase 2 with the Thames Coromandel District Council. On the basis of the information that we received, we paused at this stage and have let the Thames Coromandel advance to phase 2. There's a review going on at the moment in relation to the inland structures and whether or not they will continue to be developed in the way that the first one has been developed. And it's my understanding that we're working with some contractors at the moment to scope out the siren, the alarming system. So, but there will be a more comprehensive report coming back on that. We have 2 people working at the moment in civil defence on contract for us, and they've picked up that work which sat idle there probably for about 6 months during Paul's illness.
With the Parks and Recreation budget, into the longer term, with our intensification aspirations, at the moment our policy is to have a reserve within 500 metres of any individual or home. Presumably there's some sort of ratio around the number of people who can use a park or reserve. As we intensify, does that sort of ratio decline, or do we create more parks and people have more areas around that? And I see Kororo Valley is actually really good because it's very long and it actually, for the Te Papa Peninsula, sort of caters for a lot of that. But if you could just talk around that, thanks.
So there's a piece of work at the moment going on looking at exactly that issue. So we have a level of service standard, which is a quantity of land, 1.7 hectare per thousand, so per population base. And then we have a series of quality and proximity standards, which is around the walkable distance between parks or from residents to parks, and the minimum size and characteristics of that. So that's our current policy. We are reviewing that in light of the intensification, and particularly we're starting to look at it in terms of Te Tumu. So there's some initial work being done, there's some meetings with developers, and the intention is that that work will align with the structure planning for that area, and we'll progress through that. So absolutely, and it will need to come back to you if there are any associated tweaks or changes to the level of service policy, and then we would be consulting with that with the community. So absolutely.
If there's no more questions, anybody care to move anything? at this stage just receive it, as Councillor Robson is prepared to move, and then the second part of it would have to be added to the first DC. Is that possible? It's confused. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I suppose it means at what stage are we going to tackle, if people have got issues about any of that expenditure, what stage we're going to tackle it. Yeah.
Our suggestion would be that you receive the report now, pass that resolution, and that you take resolution B, which is the quantity of expenditure, any changes, and when you're having your discussion on DC 17, which is the overall rates level and associated capital and operational costs, if there are views around shifting the balance of either of those, because if you approve the expenditure, you actually, in effect, already set in place much of the rates rise, so you could then deal with all of that in one package.
Okay, so that being the case, you're prepared to move receipt? Yes. Yeah. And seconded by Councillor Clout. Want to speak to it?
Basically exactly the point that was made by staff. I want to receive this, but in the conversation around the overall situation, I want to allow for the debate to facilitate trade-offs possibly, and I'm sure elected members are already looking at some of these things with a view that if that debt retirement levy goes in a certain direction, they may want to see a change to this. Where we sit on that I don't know, but I'm not happy to sign it off, so just receive it. Thank you.
In response to Councillor Robson, so given the debt retirement levy and any adjustments to the OPEX here, I mean they're both OPEX, so by trimming other OPEX and not the debt retirement levy, firstly that's treated as OPEX, isn't it? Or operational revenue that we collect.
It's part of the general rate, but it's not directly funding OPEX, it's funding debt retirement. So, but it creates operational revenue through general rate, yes.
Question on that, but the exact amount that the levy will generate is targeted towards the payment of that. So it is.
In terms of the overall conversation, if we put them together, would be if elected members decided to actually make a movement to some of the expenditure within that and use that to fund a form of debt retirement, would be how it would fit together.
Roger, reply.
Okay, so I'll put that. We receive that report. All in favour say aye. Aye. Against. So that's carried. Next is DC 30, page 120, and there's an attachment A that you'll have had emailed to. You might even have it in front of you as well. Speak to that, Andy.
So Fraser and I will speak to this. Fraser's going to come and sit up beside me. Just give the apologies of Anna Blackwood, who has a sick child, is unable to attend today. This report is where we've got to so far with the update of the development contributions policy. As you will have noted, the policy itself, we're not really looking to make any amendments to provisions within the policy. It's just updating the calculations of the development contribution charges. Largely the charges are unchanged or no significant changes, or increases are scheduled and expected, like the increase in West Bethlehem. There are a couple of areas where that is not the case, which are highlighted in attachment A, which was distributed as a late attachment, and there's still a little bit of work going on there, but we'll just quickly touch on those areas. Maybe firstly with the citywide charges, you'll see that there's no substantial change for this upcoming financial year proposed, but as earlier discussed, in the 2021 financial year, so 2 years away, there are looking to be some substantial increases to that charge, primarily as a result of the introduction of the Waiari water treatment plant and the removal of the Joyce and Oropi treatment plants from those charges, but also for other reasons. Fraser, just want to go into the other reasons just briefly for the increase, the proposed increase in a couple of years' time to the citywide charges?
Citywide, so we have the increase in, yes, Andy's already mentioned, in the water. There's also some land purchases around future reserves that are coming in then, so that also has an impact. And the other one, the way we set the fees, set up the citywide development contributions a few years ago, is every 3 years the interest charge, we were trying to, rather than have it flat forever and the value, reflecting that value, we do a stepped basis, and 2022 is also a year where the stepped interest costs come in as well. So that's the sort of the three main things that are going to impact in 2022.
Yeah, so and also I think, if you look at those charges at the moment, the transport charges are very low. We know we have some significant transport issues in our city, so I think over the next few years we will be looking at that and looking if that's right, and seeing if whether there should be some additional transport projects that we're collecting development contributions for at that citywide scale. So the purpose of highlighting that now is so that we can include that in the upcoming consultation both this year and next year. Respond. There we go. We're back on. Is that something they've requested in the past? So they've got time to work that into their business models. So just moving on from there, probably the biggest change I think to highlight is in Wairakei. There are two issues there. One in catchment B, which also is reflected in the Papamoa catchment increasing. That relates to significantly increased costs for the Kaituna stormwater overflow, which is required to be built to service, I guess, all of the Papamoa catchment and Papamoa East catchments, and particularly is necessary to be constructed when Te Tumu commences development. That project has increased from probably not much more than $10 million to our current estimate of around $40 million. I think Christine mentioned before resilience adding a significant amount of cost. It's one of the reasons for that increase, and that is around mitigation for lateral spread risk as a result of constructing that overflow. There's more work to be done in terms of details, and over time that cost estimate will move again, whether it's up or downwards. We're unsure at this stage, but there are other reasons for that cost increase as well, including uncertainties around land purchase costs, and also factoring in that we probably need to build bridge structures across the overflow rather than culverts for health and safety reasons. You don't want people or animals to get stuck in those culverts during flood events. So catchment. Is it all right? You're okay?
Sorry about the microphone. The microphones are intermittent. I'm thinking of going, well, pity Dick Smith didn't exist, or I'd go down there and sort the thing out myself. But it's just been the bane of our lives. I'm sorry about this.
Okay, I'll
to the
speak up
listeners as well.
I'll speak up in case it stops operating again. Yeah, so the Wairakei Sea area is a small stormwater catchment around the Papamoa East interchange at the eastern end of Wairakei. Stormwater there does not go to the Wairakei stream. It goes directly to the Bell Road catchment and then to the Kaituna River. So that has a separate development contribution catchment there. Within that catchment there is a stormwater pond, Pond G. The cost of that pond has increased substantially, up to around $10 or $11 million, and that has been confirmed through the parallel cost estimation process for the preliminary design of the Papamoa East interchange. So it's been costed by two different parties who have then come together to agree what that cost should be, that cost estimate. So we think it's a much better cost estimate than we've been looking at in the past. And because of the substantial increase in cost collected over a very small catchment of development, the increase in cost is significant. One thing we are looking at though is because that stormwater pond services not just the development land within that catchment, but also it services the roading infrastructure, the PEI, Te Okorua Drive, and those are assets that have a much broader, I guess, funding catchment across Wairaki and Te Tumu, whether some of the costs should be spread over a broader catchment rather than just across that small development catchment. So I think you've done a few calculations there, Fraser, that you might want to speak to.
Okay, so as part of the over the entire Wairaki catchment.
So we will undertake some further work between now and the report that comes to you for the adoption of the draft development contribution policy, and we'll bring a recommendation to you around that particular issue, and there's a few other small matters that we'll be investigating as well. The reality is though that there needs to be a substantial increase within that catchment. If we are to fully fund the costs through development contributions. I guess just of note, we are a significant landowner in that catchment with the surplus land that we acquired for the Papamoa East interchange, and also Blue Haven as a developer are a substantial landowner in that catchment, and they are looking to progress medium density residential development in there in the very short term, in the next year or so, so it may have some implications that we will need to consult with them and get them to understand sooner rather than later.
Thank you. In the spirit of helping developers understand what's coming in later years, I think the Local Government Amendment Bill is reporting back. It's getting towards its second reading, and that's the one where you can charge DCs for community infrastructure. Would it be premature in some of those later years where we've got some pretty big numbers for some community infrastructure, particularly in Te Tumu, to put that into the calculation, or are we just being a bit cheeky in terms of parliamentary sovereignty?
I think at this point we can signal that if that bill's passed into law, that the council direction, if it is such, is to look to bring those charges back into the development contribution policy. There is some further work which we have commenced around how we would look to do that. So there are some choices and decisions to be made around whether they're funded across local catchments or more of a citywide approach. So we need to work through that. So it would be premature to do any particular catchments for any growth areas at the moment. But we'll definitely signal it and bring some proposed wording. Yeah.
Councillor Baldock and then Kurak.
Andy, how much is land purchase a part of that? It's about a $10 million cost, I figure, on the hectares. How much is the land purchase part of that? You said you don't know yet, but roughly.
Yeah, I guess I prefer not to go into the specifics of that, because there's one particular party that we'll be looking to acquire that land from, and we have not undertaken any specific valuations at this point in time, and but it is a significant component of that sort of $40-odd million of cost. We need to acquire around about just over 5 hectares of land for the overflow.
Can have that conversation in confidential if it's something but it's just not appropriate in the open forum.
Understand it goes back to the comment that the Mayor makes quite often, is that, you know, we end up paying top value for land which is actually servicing the development and so on. So we should have that conversation sometime, perhaps.
Under-collect as little as possible.
Conservative as in possibly higher than the outcome may be.
Just on my brief calculations, at a 25 lot per hectare, we're talking about $11,000 DC just for stormwater in that catchment, which is a big chunk, isn't it? And if we get the 28%, that helps, I guess, reduction.
That catchment is predominantly zoned for town centre development and industrial development. So, yeah, so there is some residential housing in there, but it's only a small part of that catchment. So.
In terms of the community infrastructure issue raised by Councillor Morris and that opportunity coming up, and your reference to some discussion about whether it's levied citywide or by local, citywide being paid by the person picking up the building consent or local being paid by the land developer. To me, it's obvious it's a citywide because, say, our libraries, community centres, a sports facility is adding to a citywide network. So, it would be surely a citywide levy, which triggers my issue around having the two, and I've raised this earlier, but is there any desire to have a sort of another discussion about whether or not to transfer the citywide into being collected at the same time as the local development contribution from the land developer, because obvious cash flow advantages and other advantages to it. Are we ready for another discussion?
We weren't intending to have that discussion, and there, as we have had this in the past, there are some real complications about bringing everything back to the subdivision stage. For example, if you take the way we charge for our residential dwellings, how that's differentiated between basically how big those dwellings are, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, or 3 or more bedrooms, you can't differentiate on that basis at the time of subdivision because you don't know what's going to be built on there. So there are some real challenges of bringing it all back together based on the way that our policy is designed.
Any other questions or entertain a resolution? Okay, so we're noting the expected changes and we're going to engage with the building or development community, I guess, about what are projected to be significant increases. So it's moved by Councillor Baldock, a seconder anywhere. Councillor Clout, you looked the wrong time. So speak to it, Councillor Baldock. Anybody want to speak? I mean, I think when it comes to the discussion with the building, or shall we say development community, sure, there are going to be significant increases, but when you look at the increases as a result of costs to council compared to the huge increase in the value of land that's just been sitting there, I think there's no doubt that the real costs are where the land increases, shot up dramatically, providing a windfall, some could say. But I don't expect, in years gone by, developers have come in here and decried small increases in council costs, whilst happy to turn a blind eye to the hundreds of thousands of additional cost on a section that they've benefited from. But anyway, that's just my old thing that I bang on about a bit. Any other speakers? Okay, so I'll put that all in favour, say aye. Aye. Against? So
abstain?
Oh, you're going to abstain from, okay, yep. So abstention from Councillor Mason, please. Yeah. So that's carried. Thanks. And then we're on to DC8, the Community Wellbeing Fund, which, if I remember, came as a result of Councillor Malloy thinking something.
Would the Mayor like to repeat that?
We're talking about the Community Wellbeing Fund, and I think it came as a result of you thinking something. Somebody going to speak? Oh, yeah, Megan, you're going to speak to this? Or, yeah, because I just have a question, maybe you can address it in your speaking, is that the part of that is 40,000 for Hei Kaupapa Kotahitanga, and I thought we'd already agreed to that. That was all I was going to say. So, but you can explain that in your...
Good morning. So this, as the Mayor has indicated, this paper is coming to you because on the 18th of December you asked staff to prepare a paper about the establishment of a community wellbeing fund of 200,000 to be considered for inclusion in the annual plan. So I guess just by way of a preamble, because we've pretty much take the paper as read, I think, but TCC has been very consistent in ensuring that its focus has been on enabling organisations rather than doing delivery ourselves. And in particular around this support for some of these significant social issues that we've got happening in our city. So the assessment that we undertook when we wrote this report indicates that a general wellbeing fund is unlikely to be focused enough to deal with the specific issues or initiate genuine long-term and positive change. So what we have recommended is that a more effective approach, in our opinion, would be to assign additional funding of 80,000 in the 2020 annual plan, and that this be directly allocated to key organisations to enable them to continue to proactively address homelessness, with the idea that I'm sure we'd all like to see that homelessness be rare, brief and non-recurring in our city. So that 80,000, 40 to go for operational funding for Awhina House, which is operated by He Kaupapa Kotangitahi Trust. So that's in addition to the 40 that you have already given via the Stewart Trust for set-up costs. So this is, fits with what we have done for the Tauranga Moana Men's Night Shelter in the past. So they have had funding through the Stewart Trust, but we've also given them a 10-year lease, land only, that equates, if we put a market value on that, it would equate to about 40,000 a year. So we're seeing the idea here is some equity across the two night shelters, and for the longer term, more strategic approach that the People's Project are taking. That these three organisations are all aimed at getting people directly off the streets, because we know that the government and other agencies are really trying to be proactive around the housing issue for what we call the hidden homeless, and Simone talked to you about that last week. Yeah, questions?
Yeah, no, that explains that. Any questions? Get Councillor Baldock.
Just in regard to the People's Project, the 40,000, what specifically will it be used for?
So that would be something that we would work through with them. I know that their lease is similar, the cost that they're paying for their building, their premises, is similar to the amount that Awhina House is paying for their lease, so it could be put towards that, or for topping up the operational funding that they're receiving through MSD, which would enable them to add to some of those wraparound services and provide additional support.
Is that in salaries, potentially, or?
I'm not aware of that being the case.
So, just you know, a question. If we wished, for example, to fund Hei Kaupapa Kotahitanga on the basis of that equity, but we weren't so sure about funding the People's Project because we strictly felt that the government should, you know, and if the Wise group that owns it wishes to be able to, you know, make more profit, that's their business between them and government, we could split this thing in two.
Yes, you could. That's obviously your decision. So one thing that I would like to point out is that People's Project have a contract with MSD. The Tauranga Moana Men's Night Shelter has a contract with MSD, and Awhina House is currently working, or the Trust is currently working through the process of a contract with MSD. So, and then they haven't secured that yet, but there's every reason to believe that they will because of the need in the city. So I think that the fact that these organisations are getting government funding is that they're all in the same boat there.
Well, one is a business and one is not. Is that correct?
No, that's actually not correct. I'm sorry to correct you. It's operated as a non-profit. It's not a company. The whole of Wise Group is a non-profit, and so are all the organisations that are underneath it.
Well, yeah. Okay. So, Councillor Robson and then Councillor Malloy. Yeah.
I'm sort of interested in this paper and Te Tuinga Whānau. Why are we going to give 40 to People's Project and perhaps not, you know, where's the line here? On what basis does one become one of the people that gets to sit on the podium and get a prize, and on what basis does someone wind up in 4th place? Because I'm conscious of the work that's been done by Tommy and the group down there. I'm conscious of how many people they've effectively helped and are currently helping and housed. And I'm just trying to understand if someone can give me the rationale for drawing lines between these groups and allocating funds the way we have. And I suppose I would separate the shelters from People's Place. You know, I can see a slight difference in what they do in a sense. So I suppose I'm thinking about People's Project versus Te Tuinga and just trying to understand why we're picking winners here or not.
That's a really good question, thank you. So Te Tuinga Whānau are doing amazing work and need to be commended for that. Their focus is on families, and I guess this, I guess there's two things. One is council can't fund everybody, and I think that needs to be, we need to be upfront about that. The other thing is that this, it was my understanding that when we were asked to prepare this paper, it was in response to, is that the families that Te Tuinga are doing such a fantastic job helping are not the rough sleepers. So they might not have satisfactory homes or housing, but they're not sleeping on our streets, which is what we interpreted that this proposed wellbeing fund would be to address.
Yeah, well, initially anyway, yeah, I certainly don't understand this preoccupation with equity. You know, we have a problem out in our streets, one way or another. Where the people that are sleeping out there have a problem, and the retailers have a problem. I don't understand how we can approach it on an equity basis to solve that problem. We have to decide what needs to happen, and then support that. Whether that's a little bit unequal amongst all the providers, then that doesn't matter. It's the result that matters. So I don't know whether you got comments about that. That I know it's already been teased out by Councillor Robson there, but I certainly have a problem with that. You know, in terms of equity, we had a significant problem at Greaton, for example, and it was starting to develop down in the CBD. We had to put security officers out there. There's nothing equitous about that, but they had to go out there, and it certainly helped the problem. It didn't solve it, but once again, it wasn't equal in that sense. So I do have a real concern with us approaching it from we've got to be even-handed to all the providers, because it just doesn't work like that.
Well, I probably would disagree. I tend to think that, you know, that allows favourites to develop, but that's for another discussion. But I will just ask Paul if this amount of money is included in the figures we've seen today.
No, it's not included at present.
And Councillor Mason?
Well, just going along with what we're saying here is that if we did want to be seen to be fair, it could be a contestable fund where people put in applications on an annual basis. Then it could be judged by, or could be evaluated and selected by a panel. Just a suggestion.
Well, I understood that we already approved the funds in a full council meeting for Awhina House. The only extra that I understand looking at this is the 40,000 for the People's Project, and I don't object to them getting...
Yeah, no, this is an additional amount for Awhina House. The Awhina House money has come from the Stuart Carruthers.
This is on top.
This is on top because, you know, money doesn't seem to be a problem to some people. Yep, Councillor Brown.
Megan, it was of my understanding that we actually asked you to look at all of the organisations that provide support for rough sleepers and homeless, and we wanted to know what it is we've done with others so that we can make sure that we were not about equity or fairness, but that we were aligning properly and giving the right amount of support to the right people. And I mean, even if we're talking about equity, the Tauranga Moana Night Shelter got 118 grand, and we haven't given 118 grand to anyone, so it's not really about equity. It's just about understanding where we're putting our funding. And so, didn't we ask you to do that piece of work for us?
I'm sorry, I wasn't aware that that was what was required. At the 18th of December meeting, we provided a table that did have a breakdown of many of the organisations and what support they had or hadn't received. So I'm happy to circulate that to you again.
Yeah, I think the allocation from the Stuart Trust Fund is a separate thing which we do, you know, as the funds are built up and so on. And we had clarity in the meeting the other day about the difference between the Stuart Fund and the Carruthers Fund. This is another 40,000. Is it intended this is an annual fund, or is this a one-off? I thought it was a one-off.
So this is the proposal is that it is put into the annual plan, which means it would be one-off. If it was to be repeated, we would need to go through this process again for the next annual plan. Is that correct, Paul?
Through the chair, you could signal it to be longer, and it would be included in the numbers for the next annual plan, but you could make that decision.
I guess sort of a question, if I can. I would like to know, in terms of the People's Project, with the 40,000, that we obviously can't discuss their budgets here necessarily, but I would expect that the staff have some understanding of what's in the budgets. Otherwise, we can be funding an organisation to take on more staff, pay. I have no idea what kind of salaries they get paid. The impression is that they're all wonderful volunteers doing good work, but I think when we use ratepayer money for this, it's something we need to know about before we allocate it. Helping the Awhina House get up and going is because we don't have a women's shelter, and this is something we need to have in the city as we have a men's shelter. The other debate is a bit of a different subject, really. Can you comment on that?
So in the recommendation for option 1, we have said that it's recommended that operational plans and budgets are provided by each organisation prior to funding being released. So that is something that we require of any organisation that receives rate funding, and that we receive ongoing reporting from them around KPIs, and that we work to set with each organisation, and financial reporting as well. So we are to keep an eye on exactly that sort of thing. And in terms of salaries, yes, they are all paid staff at the People's Project, but my understanding is that they're certainly not paid high rates at all. But that's obviously a conversation I'm not comfortable to have in an open forum.
Okay, well, unless we can reach some conclusion, this is going to clearly take quite a amount of time for money that's far less. But you moved as is? Or? Okay, so it's been moved as is by Councillor Morris and seconded by Councillor Brown. I would like to speak to that, Councillor Morris.
Yeah, no, I mean, I understand the comments and concerns that have been raised. If my colleagues have particular concerns around the quantum of funding, I can help them address that through DC 17 coming up next. Thanks.
At the end of the day, we need to end rough sleeping and homeless, and we've got 3 amazing organisations that are doing that. The Tauranga Moana Night Shelter, interestingly, since 2018, they've housed 37 clients. They've supported 13 into full-time work and 3 into full-time training. And at the moment, there is only 1 person that was there 8 months ago. So they are helping an incredible amount of people. Awhina House are doing a huge amount of work. There's actually a working bee this Saturday at 9 a.m. if anyone is free to go and help them. They had Good Neighbour in last week clearing out their vegetable gardens. They've been working with their 9 new board members and doing a significant amount of work to get up and running to help our women that are sleeping rough and homeless. So I have absolutely no problem supporting this.
Yeah, I'm reluctant as someone who's personally supported 2 out of those 3 organisations. I'm a little bit concerned at the somewhat arbitrary nature of the selection of the 3 in some senses, and also the identification of an amount. I'm uncomfortable enough to a point that I will abstain on this. I think that this requires more thought and possibly a contestable process, but these organisations are run by people who are not only very competent at helping the community, but are also reasonably well connected to the councillors, to the leadership of the city in some senses, and when they require help or assistance, they know that we have a listening ear and a welcoming environment for people who do good stuff. But to sort of arbitrarily allocate amounts to selected groups on the basis of no, other than doing good works, sort of worries me a little. I'm selective about where I put my money. I'm also selective about where I put ratepayers' money. So I appreciate the sentiment, but I will be abstaining if this was more thought through, if it was contestable, if I had more clarity around the basis for the allocations. It may have got my vote, but it doesn't at the moment.
Other speakers? Councillor Kurak and then Malloy.
I too will support it. It's a small amount and it could achieve good outcomes. But in terms of making it more contestable, this will go through the annual plan process, and if there are other organisations think they're far more worthy for the funds than that proposed, we'll hear from them. So that gives me some comfort.
Yeah, it doesn't look like it's going to go through the annual plan process according to the...
I thought I read the words in the resolution. It's annual plan.
So there's still a decision that to be made after you've done the remaining report as to consultation or information.
Oh, right.
So there's not yet a presumption that you will consult.
Yeah, where to start? Of course, you can't not support it in terms of money going to worthwhile organisations that are doing good work. But I'm very disappointed that this is a process that we're doing it. I was hopeful that we'd have a sum of money so that when we sat down and worked with all those communities, because we still have problems out there and our streets need to be safe and usable for all of our community. We still have problems out there. They're not going to disappear in a hurry, and I don't believe this is going to help it disappear in a hurry. It's going to support those that are doing good work now. And going forward, I chair the Community and Culture Committee, and I also drove the initiative to have a sum of money put in there to support organisations. And yet in this discussion, I wasn't consulted once in presenting this, and I find that very disappointing. I'm talking to a lot of communities out there all the time, and I would like to have seen it. I don't believe it's that useful for the council or the People's Project or Salvation Army or anybody to go out and talk to the different groups and come back with a decision. We need all those groups, those community groups, in the room to say, you know, these are the issues, these are the problems, and this is how we think it should be dealt with. And that sum of money then was there to probably support that. And we all know, and I know the Mayor's not very happy with this, we all know that it's a government responsibility, but it is very much our problem. And so I'm quite disappointed that it's happened in the way it has, because it's not going to solve our immediate problems, and we all know that. That's going to take a long period of time. And I was hopeful that we could have come up with solutions that would have addressed some of our immediate problems, even if it was on a temporary basis. That's okay. We make those streets safe for everybody. And so I will support it, but I'm quite disappointed that it hasn't been a more encompassing process with everybody included in that decision making.
Yeah, from my point of view, I think it should be a contestable fund if that's what we're going to do, and I'm not averse to helping out in these sort of situations. Definitely should be contestable, but I guess it's the same we've done in the past with the arts. We haven't made it contestable. Certain, voices are heard, certain aren't, and this is what we're going to do by going down this track. I can't reiterate enough my belief that the government should be funding all these things, and that this nonsense is of us starting it off and the government will come in and take over from us and it's just nonsense. It never happens that way. In fact, what happens is the government will pull its funding from some of these groups and we'll be expected to pick up the tab again. It's happened before, mark my words, that's my prediction. I think that especially I would have been very happy to support 40,000 to Hei Kaupapa Kotahatanga on the basis of equity with the men's shelter. But I've already heard that the $40,000 that we're considering giving to the People's Project or the WISE group, we don't really even know what is going to happen with that money. I mean, that's out of control. That's ridiculous. So I think I'll be voting against it, not because I don't support something, but I think that this is not the right way to do it. I don't think it's fair, and I was surprised, for example, to see here yesterday that we've still got, was it the day before, we've still got security guards in Greaton. Well, I was told that we've put them there for a very short amount of time, and the police and the government will all come in and a very happy, lovely place to go, and we're still doing it. So there's proof of what I say is correct. We just take over the role of central government all the time, and we're seen for being suckers, possibly because we are. That's my thoughts.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, in this area, public funding is intensely competitive because there's not enough of it for the scale of the problem. And I got a call after the media report about the People's Project that was given to this chamber the next day with a very, very irate person in a similar type of agency, saying it was terribly unfair that that money was given by the council and not to that person's organisation. So, what I'm saying is that I think we should be. It's important that as leaders we have to be seen to be fair. It's really important for the wider community to understand that there's process and not sort of arbitrary decisions based on favour. Whilst I will support this, I certainly going forward into the future, if this is going to be continued, I would certainly be advocating for a contestable process where we are seen to be fair and free and objective in our decision making.
I think some people in the community don't understand the difference between when we allocate Stewart and Carruthers trust funds and when we, do this with ratepayer funding, and I think that leads to a bit more anger than is necessary with that first allocation. I think the second allocation now of 40,000 to help with establishing a FINA house further is justified on the basis of what we did for the men's shelter and ongoing do with the men's shelter. The 40,000 of the People's Project, you know, it's a one-off. We have had a crisis of this situation with rough sleepers and the homeless, and you know, I think we need to make this contribution today to that to ensure that it gets through. But I don't see any point in it being an ongoing contribution. I think the one example, Mayor Brownless, of your argument that does contradict it is Te Tuinga Whānau, which you know, we helped with a couple of our houses out at Cameron Road when they started off. They're now renting or providing about 35, I think, and all of that is government funded. They haven't come back here. The fact that they're not here today asking us for any money is an indication that they have managed to secure government funding for what they do. It's been well recognised. There's been a good ministry to people, particularly families. Just because their people aren't necessarily sleeping in the streets doesn't mean they're not homeless. They're sleeping in cars. You know, they do need help, and they do a great service in the community. So I will support today. I've mentioned my concerns about, you know, where that 40,000 is going to go, but we do have a problem we need to address, and we are seeing progress in addressing it. I still don't believe it's going away. It will come and go with ebbs and flows, because that's the nature of the problem, and we need to have people that are there all the way through to see people rehoused and helped where they need to.
Why not? Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, no, it's not an arbitrary number. We know their budgets, and we know that they are addressing the issue of homelessness today in our community. If we were to have a contestable fund with the $80,000, it would not go very far. It would not spread very far, and so you would have to have more. But at any rate, I do want to acknowledge that we do have a $178 million contestable fund called the Annual Plan, which we are consulting on, because we don't make predetermined decisions. No, we're consulting on that next year. No, this year. Yeah, there you go. Bang.
So I'll put that all in favour, raise your hand. So Councillor Molloy, Kurak, Granger, Baldock, Morris, Mason and Brown. Against, myself. Abstention, Councillor Robson. So that's fine. So it's carried.
Mr. Chair, can we just acknowledge Phil King and all the work that he did with this work for community development. He will be watching us because he's still following with interest, and also acknowledge the fact that board members from Awhina House are watching live as well. Thank you.
Now we're back to the DC 17 again. Yes.
We haven't discussed user fees and charges yet. I don't believe. I know the traffic did hold me up 5 minutes, but I don't think we've addressed that in any way yet.
I'd like to ask questions about that at the moment.
Yeah, I've got it. Yeah, looking at obviously there's legislative fees which are set. We can't really change those, and there are good reasons why you do inflation adjustments on many of them. There's good reasons why you don't when you've just reviewed the blimmin' fees. But I'm wondering, given the earlier discussion we had today, are there parts of the user fees and charges where we could increase the fees above inflation? And just something that comes to mind floating past me is the issue of boat ramps, etc. Lake Taupo, you've got the Department of Internal Affairs, which charges $20 for the brilliantly maintained ramps that they have there. The enforcement's actually pretty minimum in terms of cost, but yeah, that's an issue. I say that as a frequent boat user as well, not somebody who's wanting to pass the buck to somebody else.
Okay, well, is that for staff to answer, or is it for us? Yeah. Yeah.
There is certainly scope to go above inflation. I think in terms of the quantum of the issues being faced though, like even the introduction of a boat ramp charge, and I know we've looked at it quite some time ago, but the number wasn't certainly in the millions. It was in the hundreds. So yeah, like I think it's a conversation that could happen into the future, but it won't resolve the issue.
If there are no questions, I'll raise my regular, if not annual, contribution to the use of fees and charges debate in our annual plans, and that is, do I have any support from any of my colleagues to introduce a charge, I'm talking about the library service, a charge for on adult fiction titles? Oh, got to raise it. Nobody? Thank you.
I would ask a question, for example.
Through the chair, the biggest component of landing charges is fundamentally with the major carrier there being Air New Zealand, which has been agreed as a long-term commercial arrangement, particularly around the funding of the new airport. So that's where the bulk of that is being addressed.
Just a general principle, and not just airport, but with everything, you know, people are more likely to accept small increases every year than us waiting, and then suddenly the headline is that you've whacked up something 20%. It might be 1% a year over 20 years, but the headline still is a 20% increase. So I just mention that. Councillor Kurak.
And just on the airport, there is still a parity issue amongst other regional airports as well. As I understand it, Tauranga has provided Air New Zealand quite a privilege in terms of the quantum of the annual, the landing charges here. I can't recall what they were, but I know we're at the bottom end, and I'd certainly like that to be addressed sooner rather than later.
What I can do with that is just circulate what that parity looks like. Now, I agree that it certainly was an issue, but I think there has been quite a lot of change in that space. Yep.
Just on DC 17, when we're coming to that, there is in paragraph 33 of the report just the discussion about whether we are going to consult, and it mentions that the reintroduction of the debt retirement levy, then a consultation approach could be to obtain community feedback regarding whether there is support for this. Well, if we are proceeding with it, and I'm probably happy to move something when we're ready to, because we need to start with something and see where it goes. But going out to consult with the community and saying, we're reintroducing a 2% debt retirement levy, and do you like it or not, is kind of, a bit strange. We should be putting up options, because we have to encourage the community to think about this. We are having to do something nobody really wants to do, but we've got these problems, so we either do this or we do this. And if we don't have an option, the answer we're going to get is probably no, we don't want to. So given the people who do engage in our process of consultation around an annual plan, do we have any idea of any other options that we could put into that consultation? Because otherwise I think it's a bit counterproductive.
Well, there are a number of ways of doing this. Either we go down that path or we don't go down that path. So, and then it's a matter of quantum. But council, in my view, would need to decide the level of levy in order to go out and consult with the community, as opposed to going out there and asking the community how much. So,
but so if we said, you know, 2%, we then have to make the decision, do we consult? Or are we obliged to consult because that breaches our significance?
Our thinking is, and we've had some conversations about this, is that when we know what level that if you are going to set it and at what level, then we can make an assessment as to whether or not that's significant, because at the moment we have got a situation of 7.5 down to 3.7, and we don't know where you're going to be sitting in there. So we would give you some advice once you've made your decision on the level.
Councillor Robson.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think Larry makes a very good point, and I take people back to the point I was making earlier. If we are going to consult with our community and we are going to have a discussion around debt retirement levy levels and alternatives to debt retirement levies, which may be targeted rates or maybe kicking certain projects into touch or kicking things down the curb for a year and a half and taking some additional risk and putting things in a long-term plan process or whatever, we will require quality information to go out to the community so they understand. Now, where I sit is we consult with our community. I distinctly remember reading something along the lines from an incoming executive, might have been the chief executive, about we are going to do things with our community, not for them and not to them. And I applauded that. I was blissfully happy when I heard that. Now it's just a matter of living that kaupapa. So, yes to communication, yes to information, yes to options. And if we need to sit and work up those options, so be it. I have nothing more important on my agenda than sorting out the annual plan with our community and delivering something by June 30. My colleagues may have other things to do.
That would sort of, since we're discussing generally, fit in with this idea that we have to take the community with us, and we haven't been good at doing that. Definitely haven't.
Well, through your worship, I mean, this may be one time that council needs to make a decision and take that to the community. I don't know that it's I don't know that it's going to achieve a desired outcome if we go out there and ask our community what percentage rate increase they would like to manage a significant governance issue.
Other questions or general discussion before we look at how we're going to go forward on this? Councillor Baldock.
Again, let's assume that we might, and I will move it to test it actually, but let's assume we might go for a 2% reintroduction levy, and that could be a debt retirement levy, or it could be a targeted rate. That's a discussion, you know, we could have with the community, because if we if we do see these other funding instruments coming on stream whereby we can shift some debt, we're still left with the number one issue in the community is transport, and we are still faced with having to raise money for that. It's not all going to come from the government. So that's the conversation we do need to have, whether a targeted rate has actually got more flexibility in it to address those issues is perhaps a consultation process that we could go through. We've got to take the community with us in their understanding that we don't have options here at this governance table about keeping rates down where significant sections of the community want it kept, because we must address these issues. That's what we're elected to do.
Well, I just think we need to bear in mind that our community, through the LTP, is expecting a 7.5% rate increase. That's what we have signalled to our community through our LTP. Through this annual plan process, there's been some different decisions, but ultimately where we end up may well determine what conversation we need to have with our community. I guess what we've done through this process is signal that we have a debt to income ratio problem throughout our LTP that we're raising with you, and that we think that warrants a conversation with the community, and how we do that may well depend on your decisions today.
Is it possible to introduce a percentage of the debt retirement levy and then have it incrementally increasing by 0.5% or 1% each year, so that it isn't such a burden straight off? Would that help at all?
The short answer, yes, it is possible to introduce it as incremental, but at this point we're just looking at the annual plan year effectively. So what I would suggest, if you wanted to do that as a broader long-term thing, it would be more part of a long-term plan conversation if the other options are exhausted.
So how do we handle next year?
That's a question, as the Chief Executive outlines, as the community has 7.5% in the long-term plan. The closer you are to that, the more prudent effectively it is from that perspective, and may therefore take lower the burden of future incremental increases.
Just in terms of signalling to the community that there was going to be a 7.5% increase this year, there's more to it than that. Whilst we agreed on that level, our signal to the community was that we were going to do a whole lot of work to bring that down to a reasonable level. So we did not signal it's going to be 7.5% at all. It happened to be in the document. We ran out of time basically in terms of addressing it, and so we're deferring it. That is correct. Anyone disagree of that? Yeah, you do? Yeah, I'll leave it to Councillor Baldock.
To clarify, I think there was a statement put in the financial strategy that there was to be further review.
I mentioned that we signalled to the community that was the case. So what are we debating? There's nothing on the table, is there? So can I just put my viewpoint in terms of the levy? I think as I heard from staff, the idea is to signal to the government that we are taking steps in terms of prudent financial management and to address the infrastructure requirement moving forward. But, you know, this is really an area that the government needs to focus its energy on, is to assisting the Growth Councils meet its requirements in terms of providing housing supply. And when you look at the root cause is government policy around immigration. We're still getting, and we have been having, large net immigration inflows into the country. Currently it's sitting at, I think, twice Taurangah's population every 2 years is still the net impact of our immigration policy. That's having huge repercussions in terms of demand on transport and housing. In Tauranga here, we are seeing both. Transport and housing is right up there, either directly with immigration, when you speak to people around the city, a lot of them are new to the city from another country or from Auckland, where they've been displaced because Auckland are frankly sick of the situation up there in terms of its roading and housing costs. So I'm aiming at central government here, not just this current government who don't seem to be doing anything about it to address it, but previous governments to allow us to get into this situation. So rather than buy into this idea that, or signaling to the government that we're going to help, we should just leave it in government's hands. They've got some solutions in terms of the infrastructure, Crown infrastructure partners, etc. And we'll look at other avenues rather than stinging our current ratepayers this year for a problem that is in years ahead. There's a bit of an equity issue there in terms of what are they paying for? They're not receiving any benefit from the additional rates that they're paying. and it's just
point of order, Mr. Chairman. I know we're allowing a bit of flexibility with standing orders, but to save Councillor Carrack having to repeat that as a speech to a motion, I think I would like to move a motion and then let's get on with the debate.
It's giving you guys food for thought before you move it.
Yeah, just in relation to the Chief Executive's comments about what we signalled. In December this year, we signalled via the media. In December this year, we signalled via the media very strongly a rates increase of 3.7%. And that was the last time we spoke to our community on this topic. So we need to remember what we've done most recently. And if we are to change that position, we need to go and have a conversation with our community. But we signalled very clearly, as a matter of fact, got headlines in some of the local media, Tauranga rates to increase by 3.7%. Big explanation about how much work we'd done to bring things down to a reasonable level. You know? And let's not kid ourselves, yeah? Right? When they think about rates, they think about the size of the bill. So, debt retirement levies, call it what you like, that it's on the bill.
I will move, staring at the camera.
Down the barrel. Down the barrel.
I will move B with a 2% insertion there into the space, and C, the proposed. No,
through the chair, you should also probably add the resolution B from DC 33, which approves the expenditure outlined in attachment A of DC 33 with no further changes, so that we pick up that other resolution. Okay.
So, speaking to it, and any of my colleagues may move amendments if they wish to move that 2 up to 3.5, which we think is being sort of hoped for by our staff, or down if they wish to. But and we will then discuss how we consult. You know, if we consult, how we consult, how we go about that process if it is passed. It's correct that our last communication, if you like, from a press release was 3.7%. Since then, we have had new information, and it is in front of us today. I believe, therefore, that our responsibility as governors of the city, we must respond accordingly. I think 2% is a reasonable middle target. Anything less is not going to address the red lines we see appearing there in the LTP projections, not the LTP we're dealing with now, but I don't think we can responsibly just hope each year to find enough savings to keep pushing this thing out and keeping it under reasonable fiscal control. We do hope for the alternative funding mechanisms, which may alleviate our debt, but it doesn't necessarily change the costs we have to deal with, and I'm not wanting to see all of those costs at some point come crashing down on every future house owner or purchaser. We know we have a struggle with affordable housing for lower, and lower doesn't mean really low income families, it just means really down around the average, and we want to still have a home ownership society. So whilst it might be truncating my political career somewhat, or giving me a yellow card in a few months' time, I believe this is the responsible thing to do, and I'm horrified about the way we, over past decades really as a council, have not addressed some of the headwinds we face. And we constantly come in and try and chop things back, ask staff to redo budgets,
squeeze these things down when we know we have to address these issues. We want a city that is environmentally safe. You know, we have the right drinking water. We have it now, and we need to continue to have it. We have to have a wastewater system that delivers hygienic standards for our city, and stormwater is becoming an increasing cost as well, as we see our meters in the ground showing us the rising water table and the increased rainfall we're seeing, which is creating flooding issues around the city. So most of those things are the big ticket items. This is not a 2% to address the nice to haves. They are all but gone out of our budgets going forward. We are dealing with the realities of managing this growing city.
Point of clarification of my, so the 2%, is that the second row down in the sheet, which I think Paul said earlier that was equivalent to 1.9%. Is that what? Councillor?
The CPI?
Yeah.
Second from the bottom.
Second.
It's approximately the second from the bottom, like it's around 3.2 million, so it's approximately that figure.
Thank you. In supporting the this recommendation, staff have given us a fantastic précis on the reasons for this basically budget blowout on capital expenditure, and that's the way the public will see it, as a budget blowout. But I think it's very clearly explainable, and I believe that we do need to consult with the community and explain to them what has changed in our knowledge since December last year. I think if you go and ask ratepayers, you know, would you like to pay an extra 2% on top of the rates increases, clearly the answer will be no, but that's where we have to take some leadership in the discussion. I'm quite happy that the key decisions will be kept for the following LTP long-term plan discussion, and the CE has already said that he would be okay with a step up with the levy rather than going for the full 5.5 million. So, and finally, I would just say that I think this is a misnamed levy. Rather than a debt retirement levy, it should really be called a debt enablement levy, because we're actually having to pass this to give us that extra headroom and keep ourselves under that 250% debt to revenue cap. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I appreciate the conversation thus far. At this point in time, I'm unable to support the levy because I think that we need to do more in terms of both the CapEx and the OpEx, and I would like to see a menu brought to elected members for fitting within the constraints of growth plus CPI plus 2% for residential homeowners. And that's a more difficult path. I think it's unfortunately easier to sort of go and shake down, you know, your fixed income sort of people for a bit more money, and say, hey, let's just whack up the rates and they'll deal with the problem. I think that we need to take the harder path. We need to look at CapEx and OpEx and try and make some of those difficult decisions in-house and shake down the organisation a bit rather than shaking down Mildred out there in Tauranga South. Now, if it does go ahead and we're talking about framing the annual plan in terms of consultation, I wouldn't like to see sort of, and here's a nice little picture here we've got back in the 2009 to coincidentally the 2019 LTP, where we've got the mayor and councillors of the day saying, help, we don't have enough money, can you help us please? I think we can do better than that, and I think that we should do better than that. We need to look inside first before we go to that lever of just whacking the rates up. Personally, I think that, you know, that may be be something where we have to get to, colleagues, but let's look inside first, and let's look inside really hard before we get to that. It's too easy to pull that lever this early in the process, in my view. Thanks.
I too am resistant on raiding Mildred's coffers, because the message to the developers who, when we're talking about other opportunities or other options to this levy, and that's in terms of going down the path of the Crown Infrastructure Partners route. So we're telling the developers now, actually, don't worry about it. We've sorted it out. We've raided Mildred's pocket for it. So sweet, you just operate as per normal. And we're telling the local government funding agency, hey, don't worry about changing your policy. We raided Mildred's coffers to sort that problem out. So we'll just sit back. We don't have to do any work. We don't have to talk to developers. We don't have to talk to the funding agency. We just raid people's pockets to get rid of the reds. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to be that, take that sort of attitude, but it's just the frustration you can probably hear in my voice. It's just the easy approach, and before we go down this route, I'd like to exhaust other opportunities. I totally agree with Councillor Morris. We need to look at the CapEx. I know some of those discretionary projects, mightn't be that easy to get across the line, and stop it from going across the line, but to claw back. But we need to do some other work before heading down here. We're a year too early. We've got a 10-year plan process coming up. That's the time that we should be discussing this. In terms of doing it this year, to signal to certain parties that we're heading down this road, it's not that urgent to do that. And I personally don't want to signal that we're going down this path because it lets others off the hook.
Yeah. We screwed up the LTP. The sad thing is the suggestion here doesn't change the colours. If you look at the chart, we go red in the same year, as if we do nothing. We go red in the same year. So this proposal actually doesn't shift the red line on the rev counter. Yeah. My view is that we should be looking next year. We've left it too late, but next year we should be looking at an LTPA. This year, whether we do the levy or not makes no substantive difference to where we are 3-4 years out. We are pulling the trigger too early. We're not doing the job we've been asked to do. I go back to effective and efficient. I go back to the Local Government Act. I go back to what we all signed up for when we stood for election. I can't support this. As I say, it doesn't effectively change the point at which you hit the red. It's the worst kind of sort of decision. It takes the pressure off your discipline, but doesn't address the substantive issue. It makes no one happy. No one. And we've got to stop doing that. We just recently had a project which successfully missed every mark, Te Papa Ona Manu Paratakataka, although I still like the name. And to me, it's the same sort of mentality here. We've got to get down, talk to our community, give them the information. If they want us to introduce a debt enablement levy, I support that phrasing. If they want us to put in a debt enablement levy, and they want everything that's currently in the LTP, right, they will tell us. And if they don't, we will listen, hopefully, and act accordingly. But this proposal at the moment gives us nothing to go to the community with. I can't possibly support it. My amendment, or my foreshadowed motion, should this fail, is we stick to the base plan, but we resource for an LTPA. We effectively bring forward the next long-term plan by 1 year, and we do the job we said we were going to do when we did the LTP. We said we were going to take time, to look into these things and address them properly. And if we really want to go to our community and say 1 year on from the LTP, what we came up with was hitting you with an additional fee. Really? No. No. So I will be voting against the motion, and I'll be foreshadowing that we stick with the status quo and we resource with a view to having an LTPA next year.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not going to support this motion. I listened to Councillor Morris, and I totally agree. We've got to look internally again. We've got to do a little bit more research, in our CapEx especially, and our OpEx. The comment Councillor Robson just made before, the 3.7% we took to our community, it was just a few months ago. Now we're going to advise them otherwise. It just sounds like an up and down motion here. I am not supporting it, and as I said before, I just want to spend more time to look internally to see what we can do, and I think we can.
Yeah, I'm going to support the motion. Obviously growth here is the driver, and it's frightening the community, and quite frankly I think they're frustrated, and we're constantly hearing stop growing, stop developing, stop building houses, stop everything. We don't want any more, but I think we need to be really clear in our comms that we can't do that, and what the implications are if we do around supply and demand and cost of housing, etc. It's not as simple as just saying no to development and no to the government. Everyone's seeing huge budget blowouts, not just by us but other councils. We've got Waiari, Mauao, Te Papa Onamora Poratakataka, the airport alterations, Kaituna overflow, and that's actually, as Christine said, you know, that's market capacity and pricing, and it's not just Tauranga, it's not just New Zealand, but it's worldwide. So I think the community are aware that this is coming for them and for all other councils. I think we need to be really realistic and address it and own it. We do need to look at the must-haves before the nice-to-haves, and I think we did a lot of that in December last year. By choosing this option, the percentage of the debt to revenue ratio gets us closer to the 250%, so it's easier to get to that when we go through the LTP in a couple of years' time. The rate increase is down for the first, second year, and it stays the same as the third, fourth, fifth, sixth year as the baseline. And I see this as an interim measure before the LTP and before all that future funding and financing options come to us.
Yeah, I think it's all already been said, except the fact is the opposing motion is that is simply going to delay the inevitable. We're not going to find out anything that we don't know, and basically our job as we're elected is to make the tough decisions. The buck stops with us. We should make the decision and move on and get it into this document.
Well, I don't support it as currently written. I think we did signal 3.7%, and whatever you call it, the extra 2% is a rate increase. So it's just, to me, a different method of achieving that. I think we've got to look at our contracts, our efficiencies. I still believe there are contractors out there that regard us as a bit of a cash cow. In fact, I know it, and I want that looked into more closely. I think that we can't let the government off the hook as far as finding alternative ways for us to fund our infrastructure and growth, and by doing this we do let them off the hook, just like we always do. Probably a bit like my rant slightly earlier. As far as Mildred goes, we've seen today that we just load things onto Mildred anyway already. It might be a minor amount, but that's what we do. So I don't necessarily, I'd have to work out if there's to be an LTPA how it would be done this year. That's the only thing, but there's got to be some sort of a, yeah, and being an election year, how we could commit to that. But however, I do favour further work on getting our costs down. I mean, already at 3.7, it's double the rate of inflation. That's my piece. Who else would like to speak? Councillor Malloy.
I think the intent raised by Councillor Robson around the LTPA was for next year, not this. Yeah, well, commence late this year.
Well, I think an incoming council will consider whether or not it's practical within 6 months of being sworn in, including, I guess, Christmas within that 6 months, to deliver a true consultative process with the community about the 10 years ahead. My sense is that it would be very difficult to, I think, genuinely consult with the community over that shorter space of time, and I imagine that a new incoming council will have a particular view on the future for this city that may differ from this council. I guess on another matter, another point of note, that the commentary I've heard about OPEX and CAPEX and digging further into the, I guess, the function of the organisation and the way we operate, I'd just like to remind Council that we started off at 7.5, and through a process of doing that we reduced to 3.7. Essentially we found nearly 4% through that type of process. And I think, just to finish off, is that if we do end up with a 3.7 plus or including the glass, the advice that we've had is that the LTP has indicated 7.5. The fact that essentially we've halved that has been deemed from, I guess, our legal advice to be a significant shift. And so we would essentially, I think, be obliged, if we followed the legal advice, to go out and consult on the reduction and talk to that. So I'm just raising those issues as Council continues its deliberations.
Yes, it wasn't that long ago when we were talking about the Waiari. I think when we first looked at it, something like $80 million. It's now, in the space of a few years, nearly doubled. I think it's well over the 100, it's up 120, 130, is it? You know, not going for that increase is good for the re-election next year. This year, sorry. And I believe it's absolutely prudent that we start building for the future, and this is part of that. You know, putting off today what you should be doing for tomorrow is just silly. And as I've indicated in my initial comments, the costs aren't going to go down; they're just going to keep going up. So I'll certainly support it.
I hope colleagues listen to what the Chief Executive just said, and at least one of them might reconsider. At the moment we're on a 5-5 with the casting vote with the Mayor, which will be a very good indication of his leadership, I believe. I have heard from colleagues about the harder path, the shakedown the organisation, we can do better. Let's look inside first. What have we been doing for the past 2 years? Well, you may have been, Councillor Morris, but I certainly have not been. Raiding Mildred's pockets, Councillor Correct. You know, when we make these kind of comments at this stage of a process, it just indicates that some of us have not been doing anything about what we should be doing in the processes that lead up to this. We just have the same old one-liners designed for political gain. Some councillors have been here 18 years without a single constructive, sensible idea as to how to address the issues that face the city. And I personally am fed up with it, and it's time the people of the city heard the kind of debate that goes on around this table. We should do an LTPA. All that is kicking the can down the road. Our city has great needs, and we need to address it. We need to look more internally, Councillor Granger says. What have you been doing, Councillor Granger? Seriously. We have placed our staff under incredible restraints by talking about how we've got to cut the OPEX, we've got to save all this money on wages and salaries, and then we want to try and do something. We haven't got enough people here to manage it. It is truly pathetic to hear this debate this morning when our staff have delivered us very good information, very good advice, and we ought to do what we are elected to do, which is lead this city into the future and provide for its needs, and not defer to Mildred, who has many opportunities to be assisted through rate relief, the rate rebate, and so on. Most people in the city have seen an enormous increase in their equity in the last 3 years, and they need to make decisions about how they address that. They have opportunities to exercise or to extract from that equity things to help them. We cannot allow the city to be held back simply because of that one issue of those who are asset rich and cash poor. So I will conclude my comments, but I think I'll look forward to, if this fails, going out to consult with the community, which has been indicated by the Chief Executive, on why we are not doing this, given the knowledge we have, why we are deviating from the LTP, and not following through with what is good, prudent financial or fiscal responsibility.
Okay, so by a show of hands, so all those in favour, so it's Councillor Brown, Mason, Baldock, Clout and Malloy, and against is myself, Councillor Kurak, Robson and Granger, so, and Morris. Oh. Okay, so it's a tie, and I'll use my casting vote for the status quo 3.7%. So I'll vote against it. And somebody else want to move something? It's lost. Yeah.
Thank you. I foreshadowed a motion which effectively says that we stick with the status quo. I think the previous motion was lost really around what was then clause B, and if we'd taken it in parts, it would have been interesting. I think here clause A effectively expresses what I believe we should be looking at here. Clause B I'm not uncomfortable with, clause C I'm not uncomfortable with. There would be a new clause D that we consult with the community on the changes or on the proposed rates level, you know, and apparently we have legal advice that this is a requirement, I understand, from the Chief Executive.
Yeah, that's correct, that the advice is, given the difference from the LTP to what the council has decided over the last sort of 3 or 4 months building up to today, the difference is something that warrants consultation. Yeah.
Can I just ask when that advice came in?
I received it this morning.
Thank you.
Prior to walking in.
Thank you.
So the Act, is it something like any significant change, be it up or down? Is that basically what the Act requires?
Well, significant, yeah, significance not defined whether it's good or bad, up or down or sideways.
So the term is change, is it change from the, or departure from the 10-year plan? Yeah.
What is good or bad? So your rates has gone down, but your debt levels, and your understanding your debt has gone up. So that's just that significant fiscal shift in terms of overall is what you're consulting on.
I think a very good example is the red that you see on here. That's significantly different to what we had, the situation we had several weeks ago. So this red is the introduction of the 128 million over the 10 years on the growth capital projects.
The reason I want to get that wording correct is I don't want this to be defined in such a way as a discussion purely of a fiscal shift and not a discussion of the underlying drivers of it. So how this Part D is phrased is important because that will communicate to the staff what the topics are we want put in play in the consultation. It's not simply a, hey look, there's a change in numbers. We actually need to inform why those changes are there, what's driving them, what the alternatives are, give these people some options.
Well, it's probably a legal consideration as to what is and isn't significant. I would have thought the fact that we are now through this process making decisions, knowing that we're going well outside our debt to income ratio is in itself the red flag that requires consultation. We are setting something in place now that is sort of, I guess, conscious of but not addressing a pending issue. Yeah.
Just in relation to that, can I ask, even if we had approved the previous motion, we would still have to have done that because it's still got the significant amount of red there. So really that's no different to even if we had passed the previous motion.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, it's still I think the fact that we would be outside the debt to income ratio in those out years, that would require consultation. So, or information depending on how we were addressing it.
Through the Chair, I just want to clarify something on Resolution A. Because it is slightly different to 3.7 in the fact that the latest Treasury forecast holds CPI at 1.9. So that actually is a 3.9% based on that resolution at this point.
Discussing that D, I mean, given the legal advice and the comments the Chief Executive has made, is it necessary to have a motion? We have to consult. We have to do what is required. What we consult on is, you know, up to.
Yeah, I suppose just to make it very, very explicit, I believe that the consultation around our LTP was an abject breach of our requirements of Local Government Act. I know some of my colleagues don't agree with that, but I'm very clearly of that view. Right? We had information that for whatever reason we chose not to put into consultation documents. We had information we chose not to put into referenda documents. I believe we were way out of line in terms of the LTP. I'm concerned that if we do a consultation, I don't want to see a repeat of that. I wasn't part of that consultation process. I will be part of this one, so I just want to make sure that, if you like, the substantive topics that are driving this are properly consulted on, rather than it's just simply a fiscal change.
Chief Executive,
Yep.
Mr. Scotson.
Look, I'll take your point. Council has to approve the consultation document anyway, so I think between now and that time, we will pull together and work with councillors to ensure that we have an appropriate consultation document.
Through the chair, we're looking to organise some time on the 19th of March for adoption of the consultation document. There is some work underway in terms of the expected content, because as we know, this has been signalled before, these aren't issues that we've been unaware of, so there is a very tight time frame. It'll be something that we'll just have to address and work with you on.
The advice we've received today, I'm just wondering whether proposed resolutions A and C contradict each other in some respects, because C assumes that we are approving with no further changes what is outlined in attachment A in order to achieve proposed resolution A. One would no.
One's on the revenue side and one's on the expenditure side, so you're okay.
Yeah. Hang on just a second.
We've got no further changes rather than the agreed adjustments.
Okay. Yeah. Those two not in.
Just finish at DC 33 full stop.
I think also a recollection from previous annual plans processes that the issue around the debt retirement levy will be raised as something this council turned down to consult on that. So I think given what's happened today, that'll probably be a healthy debate, and I do look forward to it.
I just want to address something while I have the opportunity. I mean, to try, hopefully not in vain, to convince some of my colleagues who perhaps take a more economically liberal view of politics in the world that because property prices rose 48% in Tauranga, and of course we've seen similar rises throughout New Zealand, we cannot claim responsibility for that at Tauranga City Council. And secondly, we are not entitled to 1 cent. And I use the word entitled very deliberately. We're not entitled to 1 cent of that capital gain. And the very suggestion that perhaps a reverse mortgage is an option to unlock that capital gain is the most leftist thing I have ever heard. You won't find Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the new leftists in the Democratic Party, the Greens or the Soviets ever suggesting big government on that scale. That's amazing. So I just say that for my colleagues who do and have done in the past suggested that they're economically liberal. We're not entitled to that capital gain. It's not ours to do with as we wish. And to suggest that someone should borrow against their home to pay the council to do stuff, come on, seriously? Please, go home and have a check of your conscience.
Well, obviously I will speak. I won't support the motion. I believe, this is not the right decision for our city. To respond to Councillor Morris, I'd simply suggested people have options and they should decide what options they should take. No one suggested that we can claim responsibility for credit for the rise in equity across the city. That's not what I said at all. But it will be interesting to see, assuming, depending how the voting goes, perhaps the Mayor will be again in the hot seat, which will be a further clarification of his leadership in the city. And we will go out to consult, and I hope we have a very good and robust conversation from people who are concerned about the city. I hope they will wake up and come in here and engage with us and speak their mind about the direction the city is taking in order for us to reconsider on the way through. I'm not sure the options we'll have responding to that feedback in the short amount of time we have to consult and to go through all the processes that are necessary before adopting the rate this year, but I certainly welcome the debate. I hope it is an enlightened one, and I will play my part in that.
Thank you. Although I voted for the previous recommendation that was lost, I will be supporting this because we have to obviously make progress. We have to get something out to the community, and I think that this current consultation period will be critical, and I'm sure that we as elected members will be very highly engaged with the community to get the options out in front of them and to debate them, because these are very serious issues we have to face in the next 10 years. So look forward to that discussion with the community.